Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The GPS died 3 miles before I found it. Not that it mattered. Rural prisons don't show up on satellites anyway. But this one didn't exist at all, according to every map I'd consulted over my 15 years as a surveyor. Not on county records, not in state databases, not even in the yellowed archives I'd spent weeks combing through. Yet here it stood, concrete and steel and rust, squatting in the valley like a tumor the earth had tried to forget. I parked my truck beside what might have once been a guard tower. The structure leaned at an angle that defied physics, its windows dark as dead eyes. The late afternoon sun cast everything in sickly amber, making the shadows stretch long and thin across the cracked asphalt courtyard. My boots crunched on broken glass as I approached the main building. The sound echoed strangely, as if the walls were listening. I'd told myself this was just professional curiosity, a surveyor's compulsion to map the unmappable, but standing there, feeling the weight of those empty windows pressing down on me, I wondered if curiosity was just another word for stupidity. The main entrance hung open, its heavy steel door suspended by a single rusted hinge. Inside, the smell hit me first. Not decay exactly, but something older. The scent of time itself, maybe, or forgotten breath. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with doors that gaped like mouths. Each cell I passed seemed to exhale as I moved by, a whisper of stale air that raised the hair on my arms. It was in the third pavilion that I found them. Medallions. Dozens of them, hanging from corroded wire strung between the cell bars like some macabre carnival game. Each one was roughly the size of a silver dollar, tarnished green and black with age. Numbers were etched into their surfaces, not sequential, but random. 47, 203, 8, 1, 592. They swayed slightly in the stagnant air, though I felt no breeze. I reached for the nearest one, numbered 67, and the moment my fingers brushed the metal, it began to vibrate. Not shake, vibrate, like a tuning fork struck against stone. The sensation traveled up my arm, a low frequency that seemed to resonate in my bones. I jerked my hand back, and the medallion stilled. "Daniel Morrison," I said aloud, my voice cracking in the silence. Every medallion in the corridor began to hum. The sound was barely audible, more felt than heard, but it was there. A collective whisper that seemed to know my name, to taste it and find it familiar. I stumbled backward, my shoulder striking the wall, and the humming stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I told myself it was my imagination. Old buildings played tricks with sound. I'd learned that from years of surveying abandoned structures. Metal expanded and contracted. Air moved through hidden gaps. There were logical explanations for everything, if you just looked hard enough. But logic felt thin in that place, stretched too tight over something it couldn't quite cover. I forced myself to continue deeper into the complex. The layout made no sense. Corridors that curved back on themselves, staircases that led to blank walls, rooms that seemed larger on the inside than their external dimensions should allow. My compass spun uselessly, the needle unable to find true north. It was the silence that got to me most. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of it. A quality to the quiet that suggested listening. As if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone. The chapel sat in the center of the complex, its doors standing wide like an invitation I didn't want to accept. Inside, wooden pews faced a simple altar topped with a cross that had been carved, not hung. The wood looked fresh despite the building's obvious age, the grain still bright and clean. But it was the organ that drew my attention. The instrument dominated the far wall, its facade rising nearly to the ceiling, except it had no pipes. Where hundreds of metal tubes should have stood, there was nothing but empty space, like a mouth with all its teeth removed. The keyboard sat ready, keys yellowed with age, music stand holding sheets of paper covered in notes I couldn't read. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing in the vaulted space. The organ bench was worn smooth by decades of use, its leather seat cracked but still somehow inviting. I didn't sit, but I leaned closer to examine the strange instrument. That's when I heard it. A whisper, metallic and thin, like wind through empty pipes that weren't there. It seemed to come from the organ itself, from the hollow spaces where music should have lived. I straightened, scanning the chapel for vents or gaps that might explain the sound, but found nothing. The whisper came again, longer this time. Almost like a word, though in no language I recognized. The sound made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the whisper wasn't coming through them. It was already inside, reverberating through my skull like a struck bell. I backed away from the organ, but the sound followed, growing louder, more insistent. My name threaded through it now, woven into the metallic susurration like a snake through tall grass. Daniel. Daniel Morrison. Daniel Morrison, who doesn't belong here. My heel caught on something, and I looked down to see that the floor had changed. Where moments before there had been solid concrete, now the surface rippled like water. The gray stone flowed and shifted under my weight, soft as wet sand. I lifted my foot and watched the print I'd left slowly fill itself in, erasing any evidence I'd ever been there. The organ's whisper grew to a hiss, then to a roar that existed only in my head. I stumbled toward the chapel doors, but they seemed to recede with each step, the distance stretching like taffy. The walls began to breathe, in and out, the stonework expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched my racing heart. I was running now, though through what, I couldn't say. The ground beneath me felt more liquid with each step, threatening to swallow me entirely. The medallions I'd left behind in the pavilion sang their low song from somewhere far above, their numbers spinning in my vision like slots on a cosmic machine. Somehow, I reached the entrance. Somehow I made it back to my truck. The engine turned over on the third try, and I drove away without looking back, gravel spraying from my tires as I fled that unmappable place. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I realized I'd left my surveying equipment behind. I told myself I'd been working too hard, that the isolation and the strange atmosphere of the place had triggered some kind of panic attack. Stress-induced hallucinations weren't uncommon among people who spent too much time alone in abandoned buildings. I'd read about it in professional journals. There were names for what I'd experienced, clinical terms that made it all sound reasonable and treatable. But that night, lying in my motel bed, I felt the floor soften beneath me. Just for a moment. Just long enough to remind me that some places don't follow the rules we've drawn on our maps. I never went back for my equipment. Never marked the prison's location on any official survey. In my reports, that valley remains empty, a blank space where something should be, but isn't, or where something is, but shouldn't be. Sometimes, when I'm working late on a particularly difficult survey, I hear it. The metallic whisper of an organ with no pipes, playing songs written in a language older than words. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel the ground beneath my feet begin to give way, as if the earth itself is remembering something it was meant to forget. The medallions are still there, I'm sure, still hanging on their rusted wires, still humming with recognition whenever someone speaks their name. Still waiting for the surveyor who came to map the unmappable and found himself mapped instead. The GPS in my truck works fine now. It finds every road, every building, every landmark within a 100-mile radius. Everything except that valley, which remains stubbornly absent from every satellite image and digital record. But I know it's there, waiting, breathing, listening for the sound of my name on the wind, ready to welcome me back to the place that doesn't exist but knows exactly who I am. Some spaces, I've learned, survey you back. Story 2. The afternoon sun felt like molten copper against my back as I crested the hill, my mountain bike's tires crunching over loose gravel and sun-baked earth. I'd been riding these forgotten agricultural roads for 3 hours, chasing the kind of solitude that only comes from being truly lost in the middle of nowhere. Fields of brittle corn stretched endlessly on both sides, their yellowing stalks whispering secrets in the hot breeze. That's when my rear tire decided to give up. The puncture came with that distinctive hiss, air escaping like a dying breath. I coasted to a stop beside what looked like the remnants of some long-abandoned farm operation. Rusted equipment lay scattered across a half-acre lot, twisted sheets of corrugated metal, the skeleton of an old harvester, and a mountain of scrap that time had welded into abstract sculptures of decay. I leaned my bike against the largest pile, a chaotic jumble of metal siding, broken machinery, and what might have once been part of a barn roof. The silence here felt different than the peaceful quiet I'd been enjoying. This was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, heavy and expectant. As I knelt to examine the puncture, something caught my peripheral vision. A flash of white nestled between two sheets of twisted aluminum about 10 feet away. At first glance, it looked like a piece of paper, or maybe a plastic bag caught in the debris. But when I looked directly at it, my breath caught in my throat. It was a mask, perfectly white, perfectly smooth, with no features except for two dark eye holes and a thin line where a mouth might be. The kind of blank face you'd see on a mannequin, but somehow more unsettling in its complete neutrality. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for it to move or reveal itself as something else. A piece of plastic, a broken doll's head, anything normal. But it remained motionless, that empty gaze seeming to focus on nothing and everything at once. Just trash, I muttered, more to fill the silence than because I believed it. My voice sounded strange in the stillness, as if the air itself was reluctant to carry sound. I forced myself to focus on the tire repair, working with fingers that felt clumsy and uncertain. The puncture was clean, probably a thorn or sharp stone, and I had it patched within 10 minutes. But throughout the entire process, I felt watched. That prickling sensation between my shoulder blades that comes when you know someone's eyes are on you. When I finally looked up again, the mask was gone. I stood slowly, scanning the debris pile. Nothing. Just rusted metal and shadows. Maybe it had never been there at all. A trick of light and heat shimmer creating phantom images in my overheated brain. I straddled my bike and pushed off, eager to put distance between myself and that unsettling place. The road ahead split into a T-intersection about a quarter-mile down. I chose the left branch without much thought, just wanting to keep moving. The corn gave way to soybean fields, their broad leaves rustling with a sound like distant applause. I'd been riding for maybe 15 minutes when I reached another crossroads. This one was more isolated than the last, just two dirt tracks converging with a battered stop sign marking the intersection. And there, standing at the corner of the intersection, was the mask. Not wearing it, just the mask itself, somehow balanced upright on the ground, facing the road I'd just traveled. The same smooth white surface, the same empty eye sockets. Impossible to miss, yet so still it might have been carved from marble. My bike wobbled as my hands tightened involuntarily on the handlebars. This couldn't be the same mask. It was physically impossible. I'd left that scrap heap miles behind, taken random turns, covered ground that would require superhuman speed to traverse on foot. I dismounted and approached it carefully, the way you might approach a snake that could be either dead or sleeping. Up close, it looked identical to the one I'd seen in the debris, if it had been the same one. The material seemed like porcelain or high-quality plastic, unmarked by weather or wear despite sitting in direct sunlight. There was no string, no stand, no apparent way it could maintain its upright position. It simply sat there, defying logic and gravity with quiet persistence. I reached out to touch it, then stopped. Something deep in my gut warned against contact, the same primal instinct that keeps you from sticking your hand into dark holes or picking up spiders. Instead, I backed away, mounted my bike, and took the right fork at the intersection, riding faster now. The pattern repeated at the next crossroads, and the next. Each time, the mask appeared at the intersection I approached, always positioned to face the direction I'd come from, never moving when I could see it, but somehow traveling between intersections faster than any human could manage. The intervals grew shorter too. What had been 15-minute rides between sightings became 10 minutes, then 5. By the 7th encounter, my shirt was soaked with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat or exercise. My hands trembled against the handlebars, and I'd started talking to myself, a running commentary that helped fill the oppressive silence. This is impossible. Masks don't move by themselves. Someone's playing a game. There's a rational explanation. But even as I spoke the words, I knew how hollow they sounded. The roads I'd been taking weren't connected by any logical network that would allow someone to anticipate my movements. Most weren't even marked on maps, and I'd varied my route randomly, taking left turns, right turns, even doubling back once to test my theory that I was being followed. Yet there it was again, sitting at the next intersection like a patient sentinel. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of amber and rust. Shadows grew longer, reaching across the fields like grasping fingers. I realized I had no idea where I was or how to get back to civilization. My phone showed no signal, just empty bars mocking my growing panic. At the 9th intersection, I stopped completely about 50 yards away from where the mask waited. I could see it clearly in the fading light, that white surface seeming to glow with its own inner illumination. For the first time, I noticed something different about this encounter. The mask wasn't facing the road I'd traveled. It was turned toward me. Those empty eye sockets seemed to drill into my skull, and I felt something inside my chest tighten like a fist. The rational part of my mind screamed that masks don't have intentions, don't track movement, don't watch. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that had kept my ancestors alive in a world full of predators, knew predatory behavior when it saw it. I turned my bike around and pedaled back the way I'd come, no longer caring about exploration or adventure. I just wanted distance, wanted to break whatever sick game this had become. But when I reached the previous intersection, there it was again, somehow having arrived before me despite my panicked flight. This time it was different. This time it was closer to the road, maybe 10 feet from where my bike would pass if I continued straight. Close enough that I could see the subtle imperfections in its surface, tiny scratches and scuff marks that proved it was a physical object, not some hallucination born of heat and exhaustion. I chose the only option that made sense. I turned and rode perpendicular to my original route, hoping to break the pattern that had trapped me. The new road curved through a stand of oak trees that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. In the green-tinted gloom, every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. The road emerged from the trees and split again. My heart sank. There, waiting at the junction, was the mask. But this time something was fundamentally different. It was closer to the road than ever before, maybe 5 feet from the center line. And though it maintained its upright position, it seemed to lean slightly forward, as if straining against some invisible barrier that prevented it from advancing further. I stopped my bike and stared at it, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw the eye holes shift, tracking my movement with subtle adjustments. The silence around me felt expectant, charged with potential energy like the air before a thunderstorm. That's when the terrible thought occurred to me. What if the mask wasn't following me? What if I was being herded toward something? What if each intersection, each encounter was designed to guide me in a specific direction? I looked at the choices before me. 3 roads branched out from this intersection, offering the illusion of freedom while potentially leading to the same destination. The mask waited patiently, that smooth white surface reflecting the last rays of sunlight like a signal mirror. On impulse, I turned my bike in a tight circle, pedaling around the intersection in a loop. I'd completed maybe half the circuit when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The mask was turning to follow my movement. Not quickly, not obviously, but with the inexorable motion of a sundial's shadow. By the time I'd completed a full revolution, it had rotated nearly 90 degrees to maintain its focus on my position. I circled again, faster this time, and watched the mask track my movement with that same deliberate precision. But something else was happening too. With each revolution, the mask seemed to settle back slightly, retreating by inches from the road's edge. I stopped pedaling and coasted to a halt, breathing hard. The mask had retreated perhaps 3 feet from its original position, but it still faced me with those hollow eyes. Testing my theory, I performed another circle, this one even faster. Another slight retreat. Understanding flooded through me like cold water. The circles weren't just stopping its advance, they were pushing it back. Somehow the act of cycling in loops around the intersection created a barrier that the thing couldn't cross. But the revelation brought no relief, only a deeper sense of dread. Because if circling could drive it back, that meant it had been advancing in the first place. And if my random route choices had all led to intersections, that meant my escape routes had been systematically cut off. I wasn't lost. I was trapped. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would soon give way to purple twilight. I couldn't ride these roads in the dark, couldn't navigate by moonlight through terrain I didn't recognize, but stopping meant facing whatever was behind the mask, and circling indefinitely was impossible. I'd been riding in loops for 20 minutes when exhaustion finally forced me to stop. The mask had retreated perhaps 10 feet from the road, but it maintained its vigilant watch. In the gathering darkness, that white surface seemed to glow with supernatural luminescence. That's when I realized where I was. The intersection looked different in the fading light, but the configuration was unmistakable. 3 roads meeting at odd angles, a tilted stop sign, and about a quarter-mile down the left branch, barely visible in the growing shadows, was the pile of scrap metal where this had all begun. I'd been cycling for hours, taking random turns, following unmarked roads through agricultural wasteland. Yet somehow, impossibly, I'd returned to my starting point. Every intersection, every encounter with the mask, had been guiding me back to this exact location. The mask sat motionless at the junction, closer to the scrap heap than to any of the roads. Waiting. In the dim light, I could just make out other shapes among the debris. Angular shadows that might have been more masks, or might have been tricks of perception born from exhaustion and fear. I looked at my bike's odometer. 43 miles. 43 miles of riding that had somehow formed a perfect circle, bringing me back to the one place I'd tried to escape. The rational explanations felt thin as tissue paper now. GPS malfunction, disorientation, coincidence. None of them could account for the mathematical precision of my return. Someone or something had been orchestrating my journey from the beginning, using the mask as both shepherd and signpost. As full darkness settled over the landscape, I heard something that made my skin crawl. From the scrap heap came the sound of metal shifting, pieces settling against each other with soft scraping noises. But the sounds had a rhythm to them, a purposeful cadence that suggested movement rather than random settling. I turned on my bike's LED light and aimed it toward the debris pile. The beam illuminated twisted metal and broken machinery, but something was different. The configuration had changed. What had been a random jumble of scrap now seemed organized, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And scattered throughout the pile, catching and reflecting my light like stars, were dozens of white masks. They faced outward from the debris, a congregation of empty gazes all focused on the road. On me. Some were positioned high on sheets of corrugated metal, others nestled in the shadows between broken machines, all identical to the one that had led me here, all maintaining that same patient surveillance. The truth hit me with the force of physical impact. This wasn't about being followed or herded. This was about being collected. The mask at the intersection began to move, not toward me but toward the scrap heap. It rolled rather than walked, maintaining its upright position while somehow propelling itself across the uneven ground. As it approached the pile, the other masks seemed to shift slightly, making room in their ranks for the returning sentinel. I should have ridden away, should have chosen any of the 3 roads and pedaled into the darkness, trusting to luck and momentum to carry me to safety. But I couldn't move. The sight of all those masks arranging themselves in the debris held me transfixed, like watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. The rolling mask reached the pile, and nestled itself among its companions with a soft scraping sound. Then, as one, all the masks turned to face me. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind in the corn, no distant traffic, no insect sounds. Just the hammering of my own heart and the whisper of my breathing. The LED beam trembled in my unsteady grip, making the masks appear to flicker and dance in the erratic light. That's when I heard my name. Not spoken aloud, but whispered directly into my consciousness like a thought that wasn't my own. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something that existed in the spaces between human categories. It called to me with patient insistence, the way a parent might call a child for dinner. I found myself dismounting my bike, taking a step toward the scrap heap before catching myself. The compulsion was almost irresistible, a pull that seemed to originate in my bones rather than my mind. But some last vestige of self-preservation made me step back, made me grip my handlebars like a lifeline. The masks watched with their hollow eyes, waiting for me to surrender to the inevitable. Because that's what this was, I realized. Not a hunt or a chase, but a patient harvesting. They'd been waiting in that pile of debris for someone like me to stumble upon them, and now they expected collection to follow naturally. I thought about the other cyclists who might have taken these rural roads, the hikers and joggers who might have sought solitude in these forgotten places. I wondered how many masks the pile contained, how many faces had been claimed by whatever presence inhabited this desolate intersection. But I also thought about the circles, about how my seemingly random movements had pushed the mask back, created distance where none should have existed. There was power in movement, in refusing to be still, in denying the collection its moment of harvest. I remounted my bike and began to ride in circles again, tight loops around the intersection that kept me equidistant from all three roads. With each revolution, I watched the masks in the pile shift and settle, their arrangement becoming less organized, more chaotic. The patient vigil was breaking down under the pressure of perpetual motion. Hours passed. My legs screamed with exhaustion, my lungs burned with each breath, but I didn't dare stop. The masks continued to watch, but their formation had devolved into random scatter. Whatever force had arranged them was weakening, disrupted by my refusal to submit to the harvest. Dawn came with painful slowness, gray light seeping across the fields like dirty water. In the pale illumination, the scrap heap looked ordinary again, just twisted metal and broken machinery with no sign of the supernatural congregation I'd witnessed in the darkness. But when I finally stopped riding, when I allowed my bike to coast to a trembling halt, I could see them. Dozens of white masks scattered throughout the debris, now motionless and seemingly ordinary. Trash items that had probably been dumped here by someone clearing out an old theater or costume shop. I pulled out my phone and was surprised to find 2 bars of signal. The GPS showed my location clearly. I was less than 5 miles from the main highway, easily within reach of civilization. A simple wrong turn had led me to this place, and a series of poor navigation choices had kept me circling back. The rational explanation felt comforting in the morning light. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, and the disorienting effect of cycling through unmarked rural roads had created a feedback loop of confusion and paranoia. The masks were just debris, the watching sensation was just anxiety, and the impossible navigation was just poor judgment compounded by fear. I rode away without looking back, following my phone's GPS toward the highway, and the promise of traffic, people, and normal explanations for everything. Within an hour, I was sitting in a roadside diner, drinking coffee and telling myself that the whole experience had been nothing more than an elaborate hallucination, brought on by physical stress and isolation. But sometimes, in quiet moments when I'm not paying attention, I hear my name whispered in that voice that belongs to no human throat. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a mirror or window, I see something that makes my blood freeze. My face is perfectly normal, perfectly familiar, but my eyes look exactly like the empty sockets I stared into for those endless hours at the intersection. Dark holes that reflect nothing, that seem to look through the world rather than at it. The collection I'm beginning to understand doesn't always require physical presence. Sometimes it just needs you to carry a piece of it with you, growing stronger with each passing day, until the boundary between observer and observed dissolves completely, until you become another mask in the pile, waiting patiently for the next cyclist to stop and adjust their tire beside a heap of innocent-looking debris. I haven't been back to those roads. I tell myself it's because I prefer different routes now, because I've found better trails for my weekend rides. But the truth is simpler and more terrifying. I'm afraid of what I might see in those empty eye sockets if I encountered them again. Afraid that instead of my own reflection, I might see someone else looking back. Someone who took a wrong turn on a hot afternoon and never quite found their way home. The masks are patient. They can wait. And I suspect I'm exactly where they wanted me all along. Story 3. The silence had teeth. That's what struck me first about the abandoned church as we pitched our tents in its shadow. Not the crumbling bell tower or the boarded windows, but the way sound seemed to die around the structure, as if the building itself consumed noise and left only an oppressive quiet that pressed against my eardrums. Marcus suggested camping here. Always the historian among us three, he'd researched the site extensively before our weekend getaway, rattling off facts about the colonial-era church like a tour guide. Built in 1743, decommissioned in 1954 after the congregation dwindled to nothing. The last record showed only 7 families attending services before the doors closed permanently. "It's perfect," he'd said, spreading his sleeping bag near the weathered stone foundation. Remote, historic, and completely isolated. David remained skeptical, circling the perimeter with his phone held high, searching for cell service that didn't exist. The three of us worked in the same tech firm downtown, and David's connection to the digital world bordered on the pathological. Finding himself truly disconnected seemed to unnerve him more than the desolate setting. I should have listened to that unease. The church stood 40 feet from our campsite, its Gothic silhouette cutting against the October sky like a wound in the twilight. The bell tower rose another 20 feet above the main structure, though Marcus informed us the bells themselves had been removed decades ago, sold to cover the church's debts. The tower housed only empty space now, hollow as a dead throat. As darkness settled around us, the temperature dropped with unnatural speed. Our campfire crackled and spat, but its warmth seemed to dissipate before reaching our skin, as if something invisible stood between us and the heat. The flames themselves appeared dimmer than they should have been, casting wavering shadows that moved independently of the fire's dance. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the church. Something about its presence felt watchful, though I couldn't articulate why. The boarded windows resembled closed eyes, and the main entrance, sealed with rusty chains and a heavy padlock, looked less like security and more like containment. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" David asked, voicing my own thoughts as he stared into the darkness beyond our fire's reach. Marcus laughed, but the sound held no genuine humor. "Just our imaginations working overtime. Old places have that effect." But I noticed he too kept glancing toward the church, and his jaw had developed a subtle twitch that appeared whenever he felt stressed. We settled into our tents around midnight, though sleep proved elusive. The silence that had seemed oppressive during daylight became actively malevolent in darkness. It pressed down like a physical weight, making each breath feel labored. Worse, the quiet wasn't complete. Underneath it lurked something else, a rhythm so faint I initially mistook it for my own heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. The sound emerged from everywhere and nowhere, a steady pulse that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. I pressed my ear to the ground, and the rhythm became more pronounced, as if something beneath the soil maintained its own circulation. When I emerged from my tent, I found Marcus and David already outside, both staring at the church with expressions I'd never seen on their faces before, a mixture of confusion and growing dread. "You hear it too?" Marcus whispered. I nodded, though speaking seemed dangerous, as if our voices might attract unwanted attention. The rhythm continued, and as my ears adjusted to the sound, I realized it matched our collective heartbeats perfectly. When my pulse quickened with anxiety, the underground rhythm accelerated. When David took deep breaths to calm himself, The tempo slowed accordingly. That's when the bells began. The sound started as barely a whisper, a metallic resonance so faint I questioned whether I actually heard it. But gradually it grew stronger, and I realized with mounting horror that it was coming from the bell tower, the same tower Marcus assured us contained no bells. The ringing followed the same rhythm as the underground pulse, as the beating of our hearts. Each chime seemed to reach inside my chest and pluck at something vital, creating a resonance that made my bones ache. "That's impossible," David said, his voice barely audible over the phantom bells. "There's nothing up there to make that sound." But we all heard it clearly now, a deep, mournful tolling that seemed to carry weight beyond mere sound. The notes hung in the air long after they should have faded, overlapping and creating harmonies that human ears weren't meant to process. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my gear and run, but when I turned toward the dirt road that had brought us here, I found myself unable to take a step. Not physically unable. Something else held me back, something that whispered leaving would be a mistake. Marcus moved first, walking slowly toward the church's main entrance. The bells grew quieter as he approached, as if rewarding his compliance. "We should go inside," he said, though his voice sounded distant, disconnected. "The place is locked up tight," David protested. "Besides, we're trespassing, just being here." But Marcus had already circled to the side of the building, running his hands along the stone foundation. The bells continued their rhythmic tolling, and I noticed they grew softer whenever any of us moved closer to the church, louder when we backed away. "Here," Marcus called out, his voice holding an excitement that chilled me more than his earlier fear. "There's something here." David and I followed reluctantly, finding Marcus kneeling beside what appeared to be solid ground. But as the bells reached their softest volume yet, hairline cracks appeared in the earth, spreading outward from Marcus's position like a spider web of dark fissures. The cracks widened as we watched, revealing glimpses of something that shouldn't have existed. Wooden pews arranged in perfect rows beneath the soil, as if a second church had been buried beneath the first. The wood appeared pristine despite being underground, polished and maintained as if services had ended only moments ago. "How is this possible?" David breathed, but his question felt rhetorical. We were beyond rational explanations now. The bells fell silent. In that sudden quiet, more disturbing than any sound, we heard something else rising from the underground space. A whisper of movement, like fabric brushing against fabric, or bodies shifting in wooden seats. The cracks continued expanding, creating an opening large enough for a person to descend. Stone steps became visible, leading down into the buried nave where shadows moved between the pews despite the absence of any light source. I tried to back away, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. The underground pulse had synchronized so completely with my heartbeat that I couldn't tell where my body ended and the church began. The rhythm had become part of me, or I had become part of it. Marcus began descending the steps without hesitation, his movements mechanical and purposeful. David followed, though his face showed the same confusion I felt, the sensation of watching someone else control his body while he remained a passenger in his own flesh. I descended last, though I don't remember deciding to do so. The buried church was identical to the structure above, but wrong in ways that defied description. The pews faced the correct direction. The altar stood in its proper place, but the proportions felt off, as if someone had rebuilt the space from memory rather than architectural plans. The ceiling stretched higher than it should have, disappearing into darkness that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams. The shadows between the pews continued their restless movement, and as my eyes adjusted, I began to distinguish shapes within the darkness, silhouettes that resembled human forms but moved with liquid grace, flowing from seat to seat like thoughts drifting through a sleeping mind. "The congregation," Marcus whispered, though I hadn't seen his lips move. "They're still here. They've been waiting." The shadows turned toward us, and I felt their attention like cold fingers on my skin. They had no faces I could see, but their regard was unmistakable, ancient, patient, and hungry for something I couldn't name. The underground pulse grew stronger, and I realized it wasn't coming from beneath us, but from the shadows themselves, as if each dark figure maintained its own heartbeat. The rhythm was spreading, pulling us deeper into its cadence until our own hearts matched its tempo perfectly. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there as the shadows began moving closer, flowing between the pews like smoke given form. But my body refused to obey, held captive by the rhythm that had become my pulse, my breath, my existence. The buried church began to change around us. The walls stretched higher, the shadows grew darker, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of phantom bells beginning to toll once more. Not from above this time, but from an even deeper level, as if there were churches beneath churches, an infinite regression of buried congregations, all waiting for their service to begin. Time became elastic. We might have stood there for minutes or hours. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. The shadows continued their approach, and with each step they took, I felt something inside me respond, as if they were calling to a part of my soul I'd never known existed. David made a sound beside me, though whether it was fear or recognition, I couldn't determine. His face had gone slack, his eyes reflecting depths that hadn't been there before. Marcus remained completely still, his breathing so shallow I wondered if he was breathing at all. The lead shadow reached the front row of pews and paused, its form shifting and consolidating until it almost resembled a person, tall, draped in what might have been clerical robes, with a presence that radiated authority despite its lack of substance. It raised what could have been an arm, and the phantom bells above and below began to ring in unison, creating a symphony of sound that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated directly in my bones. That's when I understood. We weren't visitors here. We were the congregation the buried church had been waiting for. We were the reason the cracks had appeared, the reason our heartbeats had synchronized with the underground pulse. Something in this place had been calling to us long before we'd decided to camp here, drawing us across miles and years to complete a service that had been interrupted 70 years ago. The shadow priest began to speak, though its words bypassed human language entirely, communicating meaning directly to whatever part of us had responded to its call. It spoke of continuation, of purposes that transcended individual existence, of joining something larger and older than human understanding. I felt my will dissolving, my sense of self becoming negotiable. Part of me wanted to resist, to fight against whatever was happening, but that part was growing smaller with each tolling of the phantom bells. But then David moved. He jerked backward as if someone had yanked on an invisible rope, breaking the rhythm that had held us captive. The moment his heartbeat fell out of sync with the underground pulse, the spell shattered like glass. "Run!" he shouted, though his voice seemed to come from very far away. We ran. The buried church collapsed behind us as we climbed the stone steps, the pews and shadows disappearing into solid earth, as if they had never existed. The phantom bells grew frantic, discordant, angry at our escape. We didn't stop to gather our gear. We ran through the darkness, following the dirt road by memory and desperation, until we reached David's car parked nearly 2 miles away. We drove in complete silence until we reached the highway, and only then did any of us speak. "What happened back there?" David asked, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. None of us had an answer. That was 3 months ago. We've never discussed it since, though I sometimes catch Marcus staring into empty spaces with an expression I don't like, and David has developed an unconscious habit of tapping out rhythms with his fingers, rhythms that sound disturbingly familiar. But what disturbs me most is what I discovered when I researched the church myself. Digging through historical records, David never thought to check. The church wasn't decommissioned in 1954. It burned down that year, during Sunday services, with the entire congregation inside. 7 families, 23 people total, all buried in the church cemetery, which sits directly beneath where we pitched our tents. I don't sleep well anymore. Late at night, when the world grows quiet, I sometimes hear a faint rhythm, thump, 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 keeping time with my heartbeat. And in those moments, I wonder if we actually escaped at all, or if we're still down there in the buried church, shadows among shadows, waiting for the next campers to complete what we started. The bells never really stopped ringing. They're just waiting for the right moment to call us home. Story 4. The Hartwell textile mill stood like a tombstone against the October sky, its broken windows reflecting nothing but the gray clouds that had been gathering since dawn. I'd photographed dozens of buildings scheduled for demolition, but something about this place made my hands shake as I adjusted my camera settings. The developer had been specific. Document everything before the wrecking ball arrived next week. Every room, every machine, every detail of a century-old industry that once employed half the town. I shouldered my equipment bag and pushed through the rusted chain-link fence. The main entrance had been welded shut years ago, but I'd found a service door around back that still yielded to persistent pressure. The hinges screamed as I forced it open, and the sound echoed through the cavernous interior like a warning. The air inside was thick with dust and the lingering smell of machine oil, cotton fibers, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. My footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as I made my way through rows of silent looms, their metal frames casting intricate shadows in the dim light filtering through dirty windows. I started with the main floor, capturing wide shots of the abandoned machinery. Each shutter click seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The looms stood in perfect formation, their threads still stretched taut despite decades of neglect, as if waiting for invisible hands to set them in motion again. It was while photographing a particularly ornate jacquard loom that I noticed the freight elevator at the far end of the building. The brass call button was green with oxidation, but when I pressed it, ancient machinery groaned to life somewhere in the building's depths. The elevator car descended with a series of mechanical gasps and shudders that made me wonder if I should trust my weight to it. The brass accordion gate was stiff, but functional. Inside, the elevator car was larger than I'd expected, big enough to transport rolls of fabric or heavy machinery. The walls were lined with scratched metal panels, and a single bare bulb cast harsh shadows from the ceiling. I could smell rust and grease, and beneath that, the same organic odor I'd noticed downstairs, stronger now. I pressed the button for the second floor and felt the car lurch upward with a grinding of gears that suggested the machinery was operating on borrowed time. The building's upper level housed the administrative offices and quality control stations, areas I needed to document before the light faded completely. Halfway between floors, my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my pocket and saw a notification from an unnamed contact, just a phone number I didn't recognize. The message contained a single image, a photograph taken from behind, showing a man with dark hair and a worn leather jacket, standing inside an old freight elevator. The image quality was grainy, but I could see enough detail to know I was looking at myself, taken just moments ago. My hands went cold. I looked around the elevator car, searching for hidden cameras, but the metal wall showed no obvious mounting points for surveillance equipment. The building had been abandoned for 15 years. Who would install cameras here, and why send me the footage? I tried calling the number, but it went straight to a generic voicemail prompt. I sent a text, "Who is this?" but received no response. The elevator shuddered to a stop, and I forced myself to focus on the work. The second floor was a maze of smaller rooms connected by narrow corridors. I photographed everything methodically. Empty desks, filing cabinets with their drawers hanging open like surprised mouths, and windows so dirty they filtered the daylight into something brown and sickly. My phone buzzed again. Another image from the same unknown number. This one showed me standing in one of the offices, viewed from behind and slightly above, as if taken from a security camera mounted in the corner. But when I looked up, there was nothing there. Just water-stained ceiling tiles and exposed electrical conduit. I enlarged the image on my phone screen. The timestamp showed it had been taken 30 seconds ago. In the background, I could see the exact filing cabinet I'd just photographed, the same broken chair, even the specific pattern of sunlight falling across the floor. Someone was watching me in real time. I called out, my voice echoing through the empty building. The only response was the sound of wind moving through broken windows and the distant creaking of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. But as I stood there listening, I became aware of something else. A rhythmic sound, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Thump, 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 thump. It was mechanical, regular, like the beating of an enormous heart. I followed the sound through the maze of offices, my camera hanging forgotten around my neck. The rhythmic thumping grew louder as I approached what had once been the quality control department. Here, fabric samples had been tested for strength and consistency before being shipped to manufacturers across the country. The sound was coming from beyond a heavy wooden door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." I tried the handle and found it unlocked. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. The thumping was much louder now, and I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. My phone buzzed a third time. The image showed me standing at the top of the stairs, my hand on the doorframe, captured from somewhere behind and below. Someone, or something, was in the basement, photographing me as I discovered their presence. I descended the stairs slowly, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the way. The basement was larger than I'd expected, extending beyond the building's footprint into natural caves that had been incorporated into the mill's foundation. The air was cooler here, and that organic smell was stronger, not just decay, but something alive and growing. The rhythmic thumping came from directly ahead, where my light revealed something impossible. One of the massive looms from upstairs, somehow transported to this underground space, operating under its own power. The shuttle moved back and forth with mechanical precision, weaving threads that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. I approached slowly, raising my camera to capture this surreal scene. Through the viewfinder, I could see the fabric taking shape on the loom's frame. But as I focused the lens, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The pattern being woven wasn't random. It was an image, a photographic negative rendered in black and white threads. I recognized the composition immediately. It was one of the shots I'd taken upstairs, but reversed, as if viewed in a dark room mirror. My phone buzzed again. This time, the image showed me standing directly behind the loom, my camera raised to my eye. But that was impossible. I was alone in the basement, and the photograph had been taken from the exact spot where I was standing. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me except darkness and the sound of my own panicked breathing. When I turned back to the loom, the shuttle had stopped moving. The fabric hung motionless for a moment, then began to change. The threads shifted and rearranged themselves, forming a new image. The photograph I had just taken of the loom itself, but rendered in negative black and white reversed. More looms began operating in the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. The building filled with the sound of mechanical heartbeats, dozens of them, each weaving its own fragment of impossible fabric. I could hear the shuttles moving back and forth, the steady rhythm of automated industry. But when I shined my light toward the sounds, I saw only empty space and my own shadow dancing on the walls. My phone became a constant source of notifications now. Image after image appeared on the screen. Myself photographing the basement loom, myself spinning around in panic, myself backing toward the stairs. Each picture was taken from a different angle, as if multiple cameras were tracking my every movement. But the most disturbing detail was that in every image, I could see additional figures standing just outside the frame. Dark shapes that suggested human forms, always positioned just beyond the edge of perception. I ran for the stairs, but when I reached the top, the door had somehow swung shut and locked. The handle turned freely, but the door wouldn't budge, as if held by something on the other side. My phone screen showed a new image, myself pushing against the door from this exact angle, but in the background, visible through the basement darkness, I could see dozens of looms operating in impossible spaces, weaving photographs that had never been taken. I tried every exit I could remember from my earlier exploration. The front entrance was still welded shut. The service door I'd used to enter the building was now blocked by a massive loom that hadn't been there before. One of the industrial weaving machines from the main floor somehow moved across the building and positioned to prevent my escape. The machine was operating, its shuttle moving back and forth with hypnotic rhythm. The fabric it produced showed a perfect negative image of my face, caught in an expression of terror I didn't remember making. As I watched, the image changed, showing me approaching the blocked door, then backing away, then approaching again, an endless loop of failed escape attempts. Every window I tried was blocked by similar machines. They had arranged themselves throughout the building like sentinels, each one weaving its own version of my trapped presence. The photographs on my phone continued to arrive, now showing the building from outside, impossible aerial views that revealed me moving through the interior like a rat in a maze. I climbed back to the second floor, then up a maintenance ladder to the building's roof access. But when I pushed open the hatch, I found another loom waiting for me, its frame spanning the entire rooftop, blocking any possibility of escape. This one was weaving the largest image yet, a perfect reproduction of the building itself, but inverted, as if I were looking at it from underground. In the fabric's pattern, I could see myself climbing through the building's interior, trapped in an endless loop of photographed moments. Night had fallen while I searched for escape routes. The building's interior was now lit only by my phone's flashlight and an inexplicable glow emanating from the active looms. I could hear them operating on every floor now, a mechanical symphony that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. I returned to the freight elevator, the only space that still felt neutral, untouched by the impossible machinery. But when the doors closed and I pressed the button for the ground floor, the car began to descend much further than it should have. Past the basement, past what should have been the building's foundation, down into spaces that couldn't exist. When the doors finally opened, I found myself in a vast underground chamber filled with looms that stretched beyond the reach of my light. Each one was weaving a different aspect of my experience: my arrival at the building, my first photographs, my discovery of the basement machine, my growing panic. The fabric formed a continuous narrative in reverse, as if someone was documenting my entire experience from an impossible perspective. My phone showed a final image, myself standing in the elevator doorway, looking out at the impossible chamber. But in this photograph, I could finally see who had been taking the pictures. Standing behind each loom was a figure that might once have been human. Workers who had operated these machines in life, now bound to them in some state beyond death, weaving reality itself into patterns that captured not just images, but moments, experiences, possibilities. The elevator doors began to close. I pressed the buttons frantically, but the car was already moving, carrying me deeper underground, toward levels that appeared on no blueprint, into spaces that existed only in the negative space between what was real and what was captured, between the photograph and its subject, between the observer and the observed. My phone's battery died, taking with it the only record of what I had witnessed. In the elevator's darkness, I could still hear the looms operating above and below and around me, weaving patterns that included my past, my present, and perhaps my future, creating a fabric of experience that existed only in the space between capture and display, in the negative space where reality becomes its own photograph, reversed and eternal. The elevator car continued its descent, and I understood that I was no longer leaving the building so much as becoming part of it. Another figure standing behind the looms, helping to weave the impossible patterns that would capture the next photographer, the next observer who came to document what should have been merely abandoned. When they find my camera next week, after the wrecking ball reduces the building to rubble, the memory card will be full of perfectly normal photographs. Empty rooms, silent machinery, the unremarkable documentation of industrial decay. There will be no evidence of the impossible looms, no record of the basement chamber, no trace of the figures weaving reality into reversible patterns. But sometimes, in the developing rooms of photo labs across the city, technicians notice strange anomalies in unrelated images. Background shapes that suggest textile machinery where none should exist, shadows that move independently of their subjects, patterns in the grain of the film itself that resemble woven fabric. And sometimes, photographers working alone in abandoned buildings receive text messages from unknown numbers, images that show them from behind, captured by cameras that couldn't exist, in spaces that can't be reached. reminding them that in the negative space between what we see and what we capture, other possibilities continue to weave themselves into existence, patient and permanent and always watching. Story 5. The brass nameplate read Murphy and Associates in faded script, but Murphy had been dead for 30 years, and I was pretty sure I was the only associate left. The building manager, Mrs. Chen, had made the deal sound too good to refuse. A micro apartment on the 7th floor in exchange for renovation work. The 1910 Meridian building needed someone with construction experience, and I needed a place to live after the divorce cleaned me out. What she hadn't mentioned was how the elevator cables sang at night. I moved in on a Tuesday. The apartment was barely 300 square feet, a Murphy bed that folded into the wall, a kitchenette with appliances from the Carter administration, and a bathroom so small I had to step into the hallway to change my mind. But it was mine, and the work was honest. Strip wallpaper, sand floors, replace fixtures. Simple stuff that kept my hands busy and my thoughts quiet. The first 4 days passed without incident. I'd wake at dawn, work until my back ached, then collapse onto the thin mattress as streetlights painted geometric patterns across the ceiling. The building held its age well. Thick walls that muffled the city's constant growl. Steam radiators that hissed like contented cats. Hardwood floors that had witnessed a century of footsteps. It was on the 5th day that I discovered the architectural impossibility. I'd been working in 7C, stripping paint from the window frames, when I noticed the service corridor that ran behind my apartment. Nothing unusual about that. Most buildings this old had narrow passages for maintenance access. But as I followed it with my eyes, tracking its path through the building's blueprint I'd taped to the wall, something didn't add up. The corridor should have led to the emergency stairwell. According to the fire safety diagram posted by the elevator, every floor had 2 exit routes, the main staircase and the emergency stairs accessible through these service corridors. But when I stepped into the hallway and walked to where the corridor should end, I found myself facing a familiar door. My door. I checked the blueprint again, tracing the lines with my finger. The corridor clearly showed 2 endpoints, one at the emergency stairs, one at nowhere. A dead end that shouldn't exist. But there it was, terminating at apartment 7G like a river flowing backward into its source. I walked the length of the corridor 3 times, measuring my steps. 47 paces from my door to the far end, where the emergency exit should be. Instead, I found a blank wall covered in the same faded green paint as the rest of the building. No door, no window, no indication that anything had ever been there. The building plans had to be wrong. Old buildings got renovated, walls moved, corridors rerouted. Someone had simply forgotten to update the fire safety diagram. I made a mental note to mention it to Mrs. Chen. That night I heard footsteps in the corridor, not unusual. The building housed 23 units, and people came and went at all hours. But these footsteps had a peculiar quality, a wet slapping sound like bare feet on rain-soaked pavement. They moved slowly, deliberately, always in the same direction, toward my door. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. The footsteps stopped directly outside, and I could hear breathing, deep, measured inhalations that seemed to sync with my own. Then, nothing. Silence so complete, it made my ears ring. When I opened the door 20 minutes later, the corridor was empty, but the floor gleamed with wet footprints, each one perfectly formed, toes splayed and heels clearly defined. They led from the dead end straight to my threshold, where they stopped. I knelt and touched one of the prints. My finger came away damp but clean. Not dirty water, just moisture. As I watched, the footprints began to fade, evaporating like morning dew touched by sunlight. Within minutes, the floor was bone dry. I grabbed my phone to take pictures, but by the time I raised the camera, there was nothing left to document. Sleep came reluctantly that night. Every creak and settle of the old building sounded like approaching footsteps. I found myself counting my heartbeats, using the rhythm to measure time. 120 beats meant 2 minutes had passed. 300 beats meant 5 minutes. It was easier than watching the clock, easier than lying there wondering if the sounds were real or just the building's ancient voice. The next morning, I asked Mrs. Chen about the corridor. She paused in her review of work orders, pen hovering over a clipboard thick with maintenance requests. What about it? It doesn't lead to the emergency stairs. It just ends. Old buildings, she said without looking up. Things get walled off over time. Code changes, renovations happen. Sometimes it's easier to block something off than tear it down. But the fire safety diagram shows. Those diagrams are 30 years old, Mr. Patterson. Nobody updates them unless the fire marshal makes a fuss. She signed another work order with a flourish. Is there a safety issue I should know about? There wasn't, not really. Just an architectural quirk that gnawed at me like a splinter under the skin. I told her no and went back to work. But that afternoon I started paying attention to who used the corridor. Mrs. Kowalski from 7B walked through twice carrying laundry to the basement. Her steps were quick and light, rubber soles squeaking against the linoleum. Mr. Jameson from 7D passed by once, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the floor. Normal sounds, normal people, nothing wet or strange about their passage. Yet that night the footsteps returned. Slap, slap, slap. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The corridor was empty, but I could see wet prints materializing on the floor, one after another, as if an invisible person was walking toward me. Each footprint appeared fresh and clear, then began its slow fade into nothing. My heart hammered against my ribs, and that's when I noticed something that turned my blood to ice water. The doorknob was turning. Not fast, not frantically, but with perfect mechanical precision. It rotated clockwise, paused, then rotated back. The timing was exact, measured, like a metronome keeping perfect time. And as I watched, pressing my hand to my chest to feel my pulse, I realized the truth that made my legs go weak. The doorknob turned at exactly the speed of my heartbeat. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my work boots. The turning stopped immediately. The footsteps faded. The corridor fell silent. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the door, waiting for the inevitable sound of wet footsteps. When exhaustion finally pulled me under, I dreamed of corridors that stretched forever, all ending at doors I'd locked but could never secure. The pattern became routine. During the day, normal people used the corridor for normal purposes. At night, something else walked that path, leaving traces of moisture that defied documentation and turned my doorknob in rhythm with my racing pulse. I started timing everything. How long between the first footstep and the door turning? How many heartbeats before the prints began to fade? How many rotations of the knob before it stopped? The numbers became obsession, a mathematical framework I could wrap around the impossibility of what I was experiencing. 73 steps from the dead end to my door. 96 seconds for the footprints to evaporate completely. 47 turns of the doorknob, always clockwise, always perfectly timed to my pulse. I considered leaving. The apartment was temporary anyway, just a place to regroup while I figured out my next move. But where would I go? My savings were depleted, my credit shot, my marriage a smoking crater in the rearview mirror. And there was something else, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. I was starting to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe the footsteps were just the building settling. Maybe the wet prints were condensation from old pipes. Maybe the doorknob turning was a trick of tired eyes and a stressed mind. I'd been under enormous pressure for months. The divorce, the job loss, the scramble to find housing. Wasn't it possible that my brain was simply creating patterns where none existed, finding meaning in random events? But if that were true, why could I predict exactly when it would happen? Every night at 11:47 p.m., the footsteps began. Every night they stopped at my door. Every night the doorknob turned for exactly 3 minutes and 11 seconds before falling still. The precision was either supernatural or the product of a mind creating elaborate delusions to cope with trauma. I wasn't sure which possibility frightened me more. On the 10th night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I positioned myself directly behind the door, hand on the deadbolt, ready to throw it open the moment the turning began. If something was there, I'd see it. If nothing was there, I'd have my answer about the state of my mental health. The footsteps came right on schedule. Slap, slap, slap. I watched through the peephole as wet prints materialized on the linoleum, drawing closer with each invisible step. My pulse quickened, and I felt the doorknob begin its slow rotation beneath my trembling hand. I counted to 10, gathering courage. Then I threw the deadbolt and yanked the door open. The corridor was empty. No figure, no presence, nothing but shadows and the lingering scent of rain-soaked earth. But the wet footprints were there, crisp and clear, leading from the dead end right to where I stood. As I watched, frozen in the doorway, they began their familiar fade into nothing. And behind me, in my locked apartment, I heard the soft sound of bare feet walking across my floor. I spun around, heart hammering, but my tiny apartment offered no place to hide. The Murphy bed was folded up, the bathroom door stood open, the kitchenette was clearly empty, yet I could hear the footsteps moving through my space, wet and deliberate, circling like a predator taking measure of its territory. The sound stopped directly behind me. I could feel presence like heat from a furnace, close enough to touch. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, studied, catalogued. When I finally worked up the courage to turn around, I found myself staring at the far wall of my apartment. But the wall was wrong. Where there should have been blank plaster, I saw another corridor stretching into darkness. Not a hallway in the traditional sense, but a passage that seemed to exist in the space between spaces, lit by a dim phosphorescence that had no visible source. And at the far end of this impossible corridor, barely visible in the strange light, stood a door marked with familiar brass numbers. 7G, my apartment, my door, viewed from a perspective that couldn't exist. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, opened them again. The wall was normal, solid, white paint over century-old plaster, exactly as it should be. But I could still feel the presence behind me, still hear the whisper of wet footsteps echoing from somewhere that wasn't quite there. I've been living in the Meridian building for 3 weeks now. The renovation work continues, and Mrs. Chen seems pleased with my progress. The other tenants nod politely when we pass in the hallway, and everything appears perfectly normal during the daylight hours. But every night at 11:47, the footsteps begin their journey through corridors that lead everywhere and nowhere, always ending at my door. The doorknob still turns in rhythm with my pulse, and I've stopped trying to photograph the wet prints that fade like morning mist. I've also stopped looking through the peephole. Some truths are too large for the human mind to process safely. Some realities exist in the spaces between perception and understanding, in the gaps where logic goes to die. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or discovering something that was always there, waiting in the dark corners of a building old enough to have accumulated its own gravity. What I do know is this: the corridors in the Meridian building don't follow the laws of architecture or physics. They exist in their own space, operating by their own rules, and they all lead to the same destination. They lead to me, to this moment, to the terrible certainty that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Tonight, I won't lock the door. I want to see who's been trying so hard to visit. Story 6. The key turned easier than it should have after 43 years. I'd expected rust, resistance, maybe even having to force the lock on the abandoned Alpine chalet that local records showed had been sealed since 1981. Instead, the brass mechanism clicked with the smooth precision of daily use, as if someone had been oiling it regularly. The sound echoed strangely in the mountain air, too sharp, too clean for this elevation where sound typically gets swallowed by pine and distance. My equipment bag shifted against my shoulder as I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The scent hit me immediately, not the musty decay I'd anticipated, but the warm, yeasty smell of fresh bread and something else. Cinnamon, maybe nutmeg. My stomach responded with an inappropriate growl. I'd driven 3 hours up increasingly narrow mountain roads to document this place for my architectural heritage vlog, surviving on gas station coffee and stale donuts. The interior stopped me cold. Warm orange light flickered across knotty pine walls, cast by flames dancing behind the glass door of a cast-iron wood stove. The fire crackled with the specific rhythm of well-seasoned hardwood, sending shadows that moved with too much life across hand-hewn beams. But that was impossible. The realtor had been explicit. No one had been here in decades. No power, no caretaker, no access except for this key she'd reluctantly provided after I'd signed 3 different liability waivers. I set my camera bag down carefully, hyper-aware of every sound it made against the wide plank flooring. The boards didn't creak with age. They settled with the satisfied groans of wood that had been recently warmed. Through the main room's windows, afternoon sunlight should have been streaming in, but the glow from the stove seemed to dominate, creating its own microclimate of amber warmth. The dining table drew my attention next, set for 2, with blue and white ceramic plates that looked like they belonged in a 1950s farmhouse kitchen. On one plate sat half of what appeared to be a pot roast dinner, potatoes, carrots, green beans arranged with careful domesticity. The other plate held similar fare, though the portions looked slightly different, as if someone had been in the middle of eating when they'd simply stopped. Steam rose gently from both plates. I pulled out my phone to check the time and found no signal expected at this elevation, but the display showed 3:47 p.m. I'd left the main road at 2:30, spent 20 minutes navigating the overgrown access path, and maybe another 10 examining the exterior. The timing felt wrong, stretched somehow, like I'd lost minutes somewhere in the transition from outside to in. The camera came out of its case with practiced efficiency. I'd documented dozens of abandoned structures across 3 states, built my modest YouTube following on the intersection of architecture and mystery, but I'd never encountered anything quite like this. Usually, abandonment announced itself immediately, dust coating every surface, windows spider-webbed with cracks, that particular silence that fills spaces where humans haven't breathed for years. Here, the silence felt occupied. I started filming, narrating my observations in the steady, professional tone I'd cultivated. But my voice sounded different in this space, like the walls were absorbing certain frequencies while amplifying others. I could hear my own breathing too clearly between words, and underneath that, something else. A rhythmic creaking that might have been the house settling, or might have been footsteps in an upstairs room. The first sketch I made was meant to be simple, just a basic floor plan to help orient viewers when I edited the footage. I sat at the dining table, pushing one of the warm plates aside, and drew quick lines on the back of a location release form: living room with stone fireplace, dining area, kitchen visible through an archway, staircase ascending along the far wall. A hallway that seemed to lead toward what I assumed were bedrooms. When I looked up from the paper, the hallway was gone. Not damaged, not collapsed. Gone. Where I'd clearly seen an opening just minutes before, solid pine paneling stretched unbroken. My hand moved instinctively to my chest, where my heart had started hammering against my ribs with the particular rhythm of fight-or-flight response. I stood slowly, the chair scraping against floor that suddenly felt less solid under my feet. The camera was still recording. I forced myself to continue the tour, narrating what I saw while trying to make sense of what I remembered. Maybe I'd been mistaken about the hallway. Maybe the afternoon light had created shadows that suggested architectural features that weren't actually there. Mountain elevation could affect perception, couldn't it? Reduced oxygen, increased stress from the drive, simple fatigue making me see things that didn't exist. But when I glanced down at my sketch, the hallway was clearly marked there in my own handwriting. I continued filming, moving toward the kitchen where copper pots hung from a wrought iron rack and mason jars lined open shelving with the precise arrangement of someone who cooked regularly. The stove, a vintage O'Keefe Merit that probably dated to the chalet's construction, had a pot simmering on one burner. The contents smelled like beef stew, rich and complex, as if it had been cooking for hours. The contradiction was starting to make my head ache. No one had been here for 43 years, but someone had lit a fire, prepared food, and apparently just stepped away momentarily. I checked the pot's contents with my camera, zooming in on the bubbling surface where carrots and potatoes moved in slow, hypnotic circles. When I turned back toward the dining room, Both plates were full again, not just full, perfectly arranged, as if someone had just finished plating a restaurant-quality meal. The pot roast slices were positioned at precise angles, the vegetables artfully scattered, even a small garnish of fresh parsley on both plates. Steam rose invitingly from the surface, and my traitorous stomach growled again despite the impossibility of what I was witnessing. I started a new sketch, this time more detailed, trying to capture exactly what I was seeing. If I was having some kind of breakdown, altitude sickness maybe, or carbon monoxide from the stove, at least I'd have documentation. I drew the kitchen layout carefully, noting the position of appliances, the window over the sink, the door that led to what looked like a pantry. Halfway through the sketch, I realized I was drawing a door that wasn't there. My pencil had moved across the paper almost automatically, marking an opening in the kitchen's back wall. But when I looked up, I saw only solid log construction. No door, no indication there had ever been one. Yet my hand continued moving, adding details I couldn't see. Hinges, a brass handle, even trim work around the frame. The scratching of pencil on paper seemed unnaturally loud in the kitchen's warm atmosphere. Each line I drew felt simultaneously wrong and absolutely necessary, as if I was remembering something rather than creating it. When I finished the sketch and looked up again, the door was there. Exactly as I'd drawn it, complete with the brass handle that caught firelight from the main room. My breathing was coming faster now, shallow and quick. I could feel sweat beading along my hairline despite the comfortable temperature. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Stress hallucinations, maybe something in the air from the burning wood, possibly even some kind of gas leak that was affecting my perception. But the door looked absolutely real, absolutely solid, absolutely as if it had always been there. I opened it. The pantry beyond was small but well-stocked, shelves lined with preserves and canned goods that looked recent despite their vintage labels. Everything was organized with obsessive precision. Soups grouped by type, vegetables arranged by size, even the labels facing forward with military uniformity. At the back of the pantry, another door. This one I hadn't drawn. The handle turned under my palm with the same well-oiled ease as the front door, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Cool air flowed up from below, carrying scents of earth and stone and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed was screaming warnings about confined spaces, about being alone in an inexplicable situation, about the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this place, or with my perception of it. But the journalist in me, the part that had spent years documenting forgotten architecture, needed to understand what I was seeing. The camera's LED light pushed back just enough darkness to reveal stone steps worn smooth by age and use. The walls on either side were carved from living rock, suggesting this basement predated the chalet above by decades or possibly centuries. My footsteps echoed with the hollow sound of deep spaces, and the air grew noticeably cooler with each step downward. The basement opened into a larger chamber than should have fit under the chalet's footprint. Stone walls stretched beyond my light's reach, disappearing into shadows that seemed to move independently of my movements. Against one wall, wine racks stretched toward a ceiling I couldn't see. Bottles covered in decades of dust but arranged with the same obsessive organization I'd found upstairs. But it was the table in the center of the room that made me stop breathing altogether, covered with papers, blueprints, and architectural drawings, all of them depicting the chalet above. But not the chalet as I'd seen it. These showed different configurations, different room arrangements, different structural elements. Dozens of variations, maybe hundreds. Each one carefully detailed and annotated in a script that looked like my own handwriting. I moved closer, the camera shaking in my grip as I tried to keep filming while examining the drawings. Each blueprint showed the same basic structure but with walls in different positions, rooms that connected differently, staircases that led to different levels. Some showed the hallway I'd initially seen and sketched, others the pantry door I'd drawn into existence. A few depicted rooms I hadn't discovered yet, spaces that extended the building beyond what seemed possible. At the bottom of the pile, I found my own sketches, the ones I'd made upstairs, drawn just minutes ago, but aged and yellowed as if they'd been sitting here for years. My hand was shaking badly now as I flipped through drawing after drawing, recognizing my own style, my own notation methods, my own way of indicating measurements and materials. But I'd never been here before today. I'd never drawn these plans, never spent the hours of work that each detailed blueprint represented. The sound of footsteps above froze me completely. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the main floor, pausing occasionally as if someone was examining the space carefully. The rhythm was wrong for casual movement, too measured, too purposeful. Someone was moving through the chalet with the systematic attention of an inspector or an investigator, someone like me. I killed the camera's light and stood motionless in the darkness, listening to the footsteps continue their circuit above. They moved from dining room to kitchen, paused at what must have been the pantry door, then continued toward the front of the building. The sound of papers rustling drifted down through the stone ceiling, as if whoever was up there had found something interesting to examine. More sketching sounds. The distinctive scratch of pencil on paper, continuing for several minutes with the focused intensity of someone trying to capture details accurately. Then the footsteps started toward the pantry again. I moved as quietly as possible toward the stairs, but stone doesn't absorb sound the way wood does. Each step announced itself with a small echo that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Above me, the footsteps paused, then moved more quickly toward the pantry door. I reached the main floor just as the door swung shut behind me. The pantry was empty, but through the kitchen doorway I could see someone sitting at the dining table. A man in jeans and a flannel shirt, brown hair slightly mussed from outdoor work, focused intently on sketching something on what looked like the back of a location release form. He looked exactly like me. The pencil in his hand moved with practiced efficiency, marking lines and angles with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was drawing. His camera sat on the table beside him, a model identical to mine, and his equipment bag leaned against his chair in precisely the same position I'd left my own. I checked my shoulder. My bag was gone. The camera in my hands felt suddenly insubstantial, like I was holding the memory of equipment rather than the equipment itself. The other me looked up from his sketch with an expression of mild confusion, as if he'd heard something but couldn't quite place what. His eyes passed over the pantry door without recognition, despite the fact that I was standing directly in his line of sight. He returned to his sketching, and I watched him draw a door that I couldn't see from my position. A door in the kitchen's back wall, complete with hinges and a brass handle and trim work around the frame. When he finished and looked up, his eyes focused on something behind me. I turned to follow his gaze and saw the door materializing, growing solid and real as if it had always been there. Through its window, I could see the pantry beyond, and at the back of the pantry, another door leading down to darkness. The other me stood and walked toward the door I'd just exited, moved through it with purpose, and began to descend into the basement I'd just fled. I understood then what the drawings meant, what the endless architectural variations represented. Each sketch changed the building, created new configurations, new possibilities, and each person who drew them, each version of me, created the space for the next person to find. How many times had I been here? How many times had I discovered the impossible chalet, documented its shifting reality, descended into the basement to find evidence of my own previous visits? The yellowed sketches suggested years of iterations, decades of the same investigation repeated with small variations. The plates on the dining table were full again, steaming with fresh food that smelled exactly as inviting as it had when I'd first arrived. The fire crackled with the same comfortable rhythm, casting the same warm light across walls that might or might not contain a hallway, depending on what I chose to sketch next. I could leave. Walk out the front door, drive back down the mountain, edit my footage, and post a video about an interesting but ultimately ordinary abandoned building. Forget about the impossibilities, the shifting architecture, the basement full of my own forgotten work. But my camera was recording. My sketches were incomplete. And somewhere in this building, in some configuration I hadn't yet drawn, there might be answers to questions I was only beginning to understand. I picked up the pencil the other me had left behind and began to sketch. Story 7. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when I first saw them dancing beneath the water. I'd inherited Ivy Manor from a great aunt I'd met only once, at a funeral when I was 12. The lawyers described it as a property of historical significance, though they failed to mention the way shadows seemed to pool in corners that should have been bright, or how the floorboards whispered secrets in languages I couldn't quite place. The house squatted on 40 acres of Virginia countryside like a Gothic toad, all weathered stone and twisted chimneys that clawed at the sky. The attic had become my refuge during those first weeks of October. From its single window, I could survey the grounds without feeling trapped within the manor's suffocating embrace. The view stretched across overgrown gardens to where the old greenhouse stood, its glass panels catching the wan afternoon light like a jeweler's display case filled with murky water. That's where I first noticed something was wrong. The greenhouse had flooded years ago, according to the estate manager, a nervous man named Hartwell, who spoke in hushed tones and avoided my eyes. A burst pipe during a particularly harsh winter had turned the structure into an aquarium of sorts, filled with 4 feet of stagnant water that no one had bothered to drain. Dead plants floated just beneath the surface like kelp in a forgotten tide pool, their brown tendrils creating an underwater forest of decay. But today, something moved among those drowned gardens. I pressed my face against the attic window, breath fogging the glass as I strained to see. The rain drummed against the roof with metallic persistence, but through the greenhouse's translucent walls, I could make out shapes that defied explanation. They swayed with an impossible grace, too fluid for debris, too purposeful for floating vegetation. My notebook lay open beside me, filled with sketches and observations from my first month at the manor. I'd been documenting the house's peculiarities, the way certain rooms felt colder than others, the photographs that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, the sounds of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom door each night at precisely 3:17 a.m. The rational part of my mind insisted these were simply the quirks of an old house settling into itself, but rationality had become an increasingly fragile construct since my arrival. As evening approached, the first lantern appeared. It flickered to life within the greenhouse like a firefly trapped in amber, casting wavering circles of yellow light through the murky water. Then another joined it, and another, until half a dozen lanterns bobbed beneath the surface, their glow painting the glass walls in shades of gold and shadow. I fumbled for the flashlight I'd taken to carrying since the manor's electrical system had proven unreliable. Its beam cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating the path to the greenhouse in stark detail. Every instinct screamed against leaving the safety of the attic. But curiosity, that fatal flaw that had driven me to accept the inheritance in the first place, proved stronger than fear. The greenhouse door stood slightly ajar, its rusted hinges protesting as I pushed it open. The smell hit me immediately. Not the expected mustiness of stagnant water and decomposing plants, but something sharper, cleaner. The distinct tang of chlorine, as if someone had just shocked a swimming pool. Inside, the lanterns continued their underwater ballet, suspended in the flooded space like stars in a liquid sky. But they weren't alone. As my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, I began to distinguish other shapes moving with deliberate choreography through the submerged garden beds. They were people, or had been people, or would be people. The figures moved with the languorous grace of experienced swimmers, their forms shimmering through the water-distorted light. They wore clothing from another era, women in sleek one-piece bathing suits with modest skirts, men in striped swimming costumes that belonged to the 1930s. Their movement suggested they were dancing, performing some elaborate underwater waltz to music I couldn't hear, but somehow felt thrumming through the soles of my feet. One of the women turned toward me, her face a pale oval beneath perfectly waved hair that floated around her shoulders like dark seaweed. She smiled, and her lips moved as if speaking, though no sound penetrated the barrier between air and water. Behind her, a man in a bow tie executed a graceful pirouette, his movements leaving trails of disturbed sediment that sparkled in the lantern light. I raised my flashlight, its beam cutting through the water to illuminate their faces more clearly. The woman's eyes widened in what might have been surprise or recognition. She began to rise, her form growing larger and more distinct as she approached the surface. The other dancers paused in their movements, all turning to watch her ascent. She broke through the water's surface with a sound like glass shattering. The impact sent ripples racing across the greenhouse floor, and suddenly I was drenched in liquid that reeked of chlorine so strong it burned my nostrils. My notebook, clutched in my free hand, absorbed the moisture like a sponge, its pages bloating and warping as the ink ran in blue-black rivulets. But there was no hole in the water's surface, no woman gasping for air. The greenhouse remained as it had been, 4 feet of stagnant floodwater reflecting my flashlight beam back at me like a mirror. I fled. The next morning brought doubt and the kind of rational explanations that daylight always provides. I'd been tired, overwhelmed by the stress of managing the estate. The shadows cast by floating debris had created an optical illusion, nothing more. The chlorine smell could be explained by old cleaning supplies stored somewhere in the greenhouse. The sensation of being splashed was simply rain finding its way through the building's compromised roof. But my notebook told a different story. Its pages remained warped and stained, filled with the lingering scent of pool chemicals that grew stronger rather than weaker as the day progressed. I tried to convince myself that I'd dropped it in a puddle during my panicked retreat, but the damage seemed too extensive, too specific. That afternoon, I called Hartwell to ask about the greenhouse's history. His voice grew even more hesitant than usual when I mentioned the flooding. "Been that way since before I started managing the property," he said, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. "Previous owner tried to have it drained once, but..." He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging like a spider's web in the silence between us. "But what?" "Well, sir, it just filled back up. Same night they pumped it out. Happened 3 times before they gave up trying. Some problems, they say, are better left alone." After we hung up, I spent hours researching the manor's history online. Built in 1923 by railroad magnate Edmund Blackwood, it had served as a summer retreat for wealthy families throughout the 1920s and 30s. Society pages from the era showed elegant parties held on the grounds, including elaborate swimming exhibitions in what was then described as an innovative indoor pool facility. The last entry I found was from August 1934, a brief newspaper item reporting that the Blackwood family had discontinued their annual summer gatherings at Ivy Manor following an unfortunate incident during their traditional end-of-season celebration. No details were provided, but the property had remained largely vacant since then, passing through a succession of distant relatives who rarely visited. The greenhouse, I realized, had been the indoor pool. As darkness fell, I found myself drawn once again to the attic window. The lanterns appeared right on schedule, followed by the graceful forms of the swimmers. But tonight, I noticed something new. They seemed to be watching me as much as I was watching them. Their movements had become more pronounced, more obviously theatrical, as if they were performing specifically for my benefit. The woman who had risen to the surface the night before floated near the glass wall closest to the manor. Even through the distortion of water and distance, I could see her looking directly at me. She raised one arm and beckoned, the gesture both invitation and warning. I didn't approach the greenhouse that night, or the next, but the swimmers grew more insistent. Their lanterns burned brighter, their movements became more frantic. Sometimes I thought I could hear music drifting across the grounds, the distant sound of a jazz orchestra playing melodies that made my teeth ache with their beauty. By the 4th night, they had multiplied. Where before there had been 6 or 7 figures, now there were dozens, filling the greenhouse with a crowd of underwater revelers. They pressed against the glass walls, their faces creating pale smudges against the transparent barrier. Some appeared to be trying to communicate, their mouths moving in silent conversation. Others simply stared with expressions I couldn't interpret. The rational explanations were becoming harder to maintain. I'd started sleeping during the day and spending my nights at the attic window, documenting everything I observed. The notebook I'd begun as a record of the manor's mundane quirks had transformed into something else entirely. A chronicle of impossible events recorded in ink that sometimes ran blue-black and sometimes ran red, though I couldn't remember changing pens. On the 7th night, They began to emerge. It started with just one figure, a man in striped swimming trunks who seemed to step out of the water without creating so much as a ripple. He stood on the greenhouse floor, perfectly dry despite having been submerged moments before, and began walking toward the exit. Others followed, materializing from the depths like actors stepping onto a stage. They moved across the grounds with purpose, their 1930s swimming attire incongruous against the overgrown garden paths. But instead of approaching the manor, they spread out across the property, taking positions among the trees and hedgerows as if assuming guard duty. I understood then that they were waiting for something, or someone. The woman who had first acknowledged my presence appeared last, rising from the center of the greenhouse pool with regal grace. She wore a black swimming costume that seemed to absorb the lantern light, and when she looked up at my window, her smile was both beautiful and terrible. She began walking toward the manor. I locked every door I could find, though some part of me knew it was futile. The swimmers were already inside the house, had always been inside the house. The footsteps in the hallway, the shifting photographs, the cold spots and whispered conversations in empty rooms. They had been trying to tell me something from the moment I arrived, and my stubborn insistence on rational explanations had only delayed the inevitable. The woman found me in the library, where I'd barricaded myself behind an overturned desk with my notebook clutched against my chest. She stood in the doorway, no longer wet, but somehow still carrying the scent of chlorinated water, and spoke in a voice like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "You've been watching us," she said, stepping into the room with movements that seemed to ripple through the air itself. "But have you understood what you're seeing?" I couldn't answer. The words stuck in my throat like stones, weighted down by a fear that was rapidly transforming into something else. Recognition, perhaps, or remembrance. "The celebration never ended," she continued, moving closer. "It only moved, from the pool to the greenhouse, from 1934 to now, from water to other things." She gestured to my notebook, and I looked down to see that the pages were filled with handwriting that wasn't mine. Detailed accounts of swimming parties and midnight revelries, written in an elegant script that predated my birth by decades. Stories of summer nights when the pool had been filled with more than water, when the boundary between celebration and something darker had dissolved like chlorine tablets in warm liquid. "Edmund understood," the woman said, her voice growing fainter as if she were speaking from a great distance. "He knew what the water could show, what it could preserve, but he couldn't control it. No one can." The room began to fill with the sound of splashing, though no water was visible. The swimmers from the greenhouse materialized one by one, their bodies translucent in the library's lamplight, until the space was crowded with figures from an era that refused to stay buried. They began to dance again, their movements creating ripples in the air that I could somehow feel against my skin. The music I'd been hearing grew louder, a jazz orchestra playing a waltz that seemed to bend time around its melody. The library walls became transparent, revealing the greenhouse beyond, its flooded interior now somehow connected to the room where I sat. I understood then that I had never been watching them from outside. I had always been part of the celebration, just another swimmer in the endless party that had begun in 1934 and would continue long after my own contributions were forgotten. The notebook fell from my hands, its pages fluttering open to reveal entry after entry written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of creating them. Detailed observations of swimming parties that I had attended, conversations with guests whose names I somehow knew, descriptions of underwater dances that felt as familiar as breathing. The woman extended her hand toward me, and I could see that her fingers were webbed like a swimmer's, though whether this was natural or the result of prolonged submersion, I couldn't say. "The water remembers everything," she said, her voice now just a whisper that might have been the wind through broken glass or the sound of waves lapping against a pool's edge. "Every celebration, every gathering, every moment of joy that refuses to die. It preserves what matters most." I reached for her hand, though I couldn't be sure if the movement was voluntary or simply the next step in a dance I'd been learning without realizing it. Her skin felt like cool water against my palm, and when our fingers touched, I could taste chlorine on my tongue. The library dissolved around us, revealing the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of rational explanation and willful blindness. The greenhouse was empty of water, its floor covered with carefully arranged chairs facing a small stage where musicians in 1930s evening wear played instruments that gleamed like captured starlight. I was no longer in my modern clothes, but wearing a swimming costume that fit perfectly, as if it had been tailored specifically for me decades before my birth. The notebook in my hand had become a program for the evening's entertainment, printed on paper that felt both ancient and impossibly fresh. The celebration had been waiting for me all along. Every night at the attic window, every glimpse of underwater dancers, every impossible occurrence had been an invitation I was finally ready to accept. The swimmers weren't trapped in the past. They had simply found a way to make the past eternal, to preserve the joy and connection of perfect summer nights in a medium that could never decay. As I took my place among the dancers, moving to music that had been playing for nearly a century, I realized that the real horror wasn't in what I had witnessed. It was in the gradual understanding that some celebrations are so perfect, so crystalline in their happiness, that they can't be allowed to end. The water would always remember. The party would always continue. And now, finally I was home. Story 8. The granite beneath my boots held the kind of silence that makes you check your pulse, just to remember you're alive. 3 years had passed since I'd lost my grandfather's watch somewhere along this godforsaken trail in the Ansel Adams wilderness, and here I was again, retracing steps that had haunted my sleep for 1,000 nights. The October air bit at my exposed skin with the particular cruelty reserved for high-altitude afternoons, when the sun lies about its warmth while shadows pool like spilled ink between the rocks. I'd convinced myself this return was about closure, about finally accepting that some things stay lost. But as I picked my way along the narrow path that skirted Devil's Canyon, I knew I was lying to myself with the same practiced ease I'd been using for 3 years. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. I needed that watch back, not for its monetary value, though a 1943 Hamilton was nothing to scoff at, but because it was the last tangible connection to a man who'd taught me that time was the only currency that mattered, and I'd been spending mine like a fool ever since. The trail markers here were few and far between, weathered wooden posts that seemed to emerge from the landscape like ancient totems. I'd been hiking for 6 hours, my internal compass guided by fragments of memory and the occasional cairn left by previous travelers. The familiar ache in my calves told me I was close to the spot where everything had gone wrong 3 years ago. Back then, I'd been showing off for a group of college friends, taking unnecessary risks on loose scree just to prove I belonged in these mountains. The watch had slipped from my wrist somewhere during a particularly stupid scramble up a rock face that any sane person would have avoided. Now, hiking alone with nothing but the steady rhythm of my breath and the distant whisper of wind through granite cracks, I felt the first stirring of unease. Not the healthy wariness that keeps you alive in the backcountry, but something deeper. Something that made the hair on my forearms stand at attention despite the afternoon heat. The feeling intensified when I reached the boulder field, where I was certain the watch had been lost. The area looked exactly as I remembered. Massive granite slabs scattered like a giant's discarded toys, creating a maze of narrow passages and hidden alcoves. But something was different. Wrong. I stood at the edge of the field, scanning the rocks for any glint of metal, when my eyes caught something that made my stomach lurch sideways. Footprints. Bare footprints pressed into a patch of sandy soil between 2 boulders. I knelt beside them, my pack hitting the ground with a dull thud that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The prints were clearly human, roughly my size, but as I studied them more closely, my brain began to process details that didn't make sense. The heel impressions were where I'd expect to find toe marks. The deepest part of each print, where a person's weight would naturally fall, was at what should have been the back of the foot. Someone had been walking backward. Recently, I stood slowly, my knees protesting after the long hike, and followed the trail of reversed prints with my eyes. They led deeper into the boulder field, weaving between the massive stones in a pattern that seemed almost choreographed. Every 20 feet or so, the prints would pause, both feet side by side, as if the walker had stopped to look at something or listen. The logical part of my brain, the part that had earned me a master's degree in geology and a reputation for methodical thinking, began constructing rational explanations. Someone playing a prank, a hiker with an unusual gait, maybe even another person searching for something they'd lost, walking backward to retrace their steps more carefully. But logic felt thin up here, stretched to breaking by the altitude and the isolation, and there was something about the prints that logic couldn't explain away. They were exactly my size, not close, not approximately, exactly. I pulled my hiking boot off my right foot and placed it next to one of the prints. Perfect match, down to the slight wear pattern on the outer edge where I favored my left leg after an old climbing injury. The October sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks, and shadows were growing longer, more aggressive. I should have been heading back to the trailhead, should have been thinking about the 2-hour hike to my car and the long drive back to civilization. Instead, I found myself following the backward trail deeper into the boulder field, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name. The prints led me through passages I didn't remember from my previous visit, between rocks that seemed to lean inward as I passed, creating corridors that felt increasingly claustrophobic despite the open sky above. The temperature was dropping faster than it should have, and I found myself checking my phone repeatedly, though I'd known since morning that there was no cell service in this part of the wilderness. 20 minutes into following the trail, I came across something that stopped me cold. Scraped into the surface of a granite slab, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were the initials, MJR. My initials. Marcus James Reed. But the scratches were old, weathered by years of freeze-thaw cycles. They looked like they'd been there for decades. I hadn't carved my initials into anything on my previous trip. I was certain of that. I'd been focused entirely on impressing my friends, and then, after losing the watch, consumed with searching every crevice and shadow. There had been no time for vandalism, no moment when I would have stopped to mark my passage in stone. The backward footprints continued past the carved initials, and I followed them with growing unease. The shadows were lengthening now, reaching across the boulder field like fingers, and the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath in small puffs. I should have been getting cold, but instead I felt overheated, sweat dampening my shirt despite the chill air. It was then that I noticed the silence. Complete silence. No bird calls, no insects, no distant traffic from the highway that I knew lay somewhere beyond the mountains. Even the wind had stopped. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft scrape of my boots against stone. The footprint trail led me to a natural amphitheater formed by a circle of massive boulders, their surfaces smooth and curved like sleeping giants. In the center of this space, the backward prints stopped abruptly, both feet together, as if the walker had simply vanished into the thin mountain air. I stood at the edge of the circle, my pack feeling suddenly heavy on my shoulders, and tried to process what I was seeing. The space felt charged, electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. But the sky was clear, painted in the soft pastels of approaching dusk. That's when I heard it. A faint mechanical clicking, rhythmic and familiar. The sound of a recording device. My blood went cold. I'd brought a small digital recorder, part of my habit of documenting hikes for my geology blog. It had been secured in the interior pocket of my pack, zipped and clipped shut. I'd checked it just an hour earlier when stopping for water. The clicking was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run, to abandon this place and its impossible footprints and carved initials. But I couldn't move. I was frozen by a terror that went deeper than fear of bears or rock slides or any other wilderness hazard. This was the terror of confronting something that shouldn't exist. The recorder sat on a flat boulder about 10 feet away, its small LED light blinking red. Recording. It had somehow escaped my pack without me noticing, transported itself to this stone platform, and begun documenting What? I approached it with the careful steps of someone walking across thin ice, expecting the ground to give way beneath me at any moment. The device looked exactly like mine. Same model, same scratches on the case, same small dent on one corner where I'd dropped it during a hike in Yosemite 2 summers earlier. But as I reached for it, my fingers trembling with cold and fear, I noticed something that made my vision blur at the edges. There was a small piece of tape on the back, labeled in my own handwriting, Ansel Adams Return, Day 1. Day 1. But this was my first day back. My only day back. The recorder continued its mechanical clicking, and I realized it wasn't recording. It was playing back. The LED wasn't the red of active recording, but the green of playback mode. And as I stood there in the gathering darkness of the Boulder amphitheater, I began to hear voices emerging from its tiny speaker. My voice. But not just my voice as it was now, standing in this impossible place beside these backward footprints. It was my voice from moments in the future, words I hadn't spoken yet, but somehow knew I was about to speak. The footprints are mine, the recorder whispered in my own voice. They've always been mine. I've been walking backward through my own steps, following myself in an endless loop. I hadn't said those words, but as they emerged from the speaker, I felt them forming in my throat, felt the truth of them settling into my chest like a weight I'd been carrying without knowing it. The recorder continued. I lost more than a watch 3 years ago. I lost my way forward, and now I'm trapped here, retracing the same path, leaving the same signs, finding the same clues. The initials in the rock aren't from this trip or the last one. They're from every trip, carved by every version of myself that stood in this place. My mouth was moving now, forming the words that the recorder had already captured, speaking in perfect synchronization with my own voice from the device. The boundary between past and future was dissolving, and I was caught in the space between them, a prisoner of my own repetition. The watch is here. It's always been here. But every time I find it, every time I put it back on my wrist, I forget that I've found it. I forget that I've been here before. And I walk away, only to return again, following my own backward footprints in an endless spiral. The darkness was complete now, but somehow I could still see clearly, as if the stones themselves were emitting a faint phosphorescent glow, or perhaps my eyes had adjusted to something other than light, some spectrum of perception that didn't belong to the normal world. I looked down at my wrist, and there it was, my grandfather's watch, exactly where it should have been, its familiar weight against my skin. The leather strap was worn soft with age, the face scratched but still readable in the strange non-light of this place. It showed 6:47 p.m., the exact time I'd lost it 3 years ago. But I remembered putting it on this morning. I remembered checking the time repeatedly during my hike. I remembered the empty feeling on my wrist that had driven me back to these mountains. Both memories were true. Both memories were false. The recorder clicked off, its battery exhausted or its purpose fulfilled. In the sudden silence, I heard something that made my soul contract with recognition. Footsteps, approaching from the direction I'd come, following the same path I'd taken through the boulder field. But the steps were wrong. They were moving forward but sounding backward, like someone walking normally but with the audio reversed. And I knew, with the certainty of someone who'd lived this moment countless times before, that when the walker emerged into this stone amphitheater, I would see my own face, my own clothes, my own confusion, and growing terror. He would be carrying the same pack, following the same backward footprints, drawn by the same compulsion to find what he'd lost. And somewhere in his pack, a digital recorder would be waiting to capture the words he was about to speak, words that would guide the next version of himself through this same labyrinth of repetition. The footsteps grew closer, and I understood finally why the prince had been walking backward. They weren't the marks of someone retreating. They were the signs of someone who had learned to see time differently, who had accepted that in this place, cause and effect flowed in directions that had no names. I began walking backward myself now, my feet finding the prints I'd made without conscious thought, my body moving in perfect synchronization with steps I'd taken an eternity ago. and would take an eternity from now. As I walked, I began to speak, knowing that somewhere ahead of me, or behind me, or outside the concept of sequence entirely, a recorder was waiting to capture my words. "The watch is not what I lost," I heard myself saying, my voice carried away by the wind that had returned with the darkness. "Time is not linear here. Memory is not reliable, and I am not alone." The footsteps behind me had stopped, and I knew without looking that another version of myself was standing in the center of the stone circle, staring at a recorder that shouldn't exist, listening to words that hadn't been spoken yet. I continued walking backward, my feet following the ancient pattern worn into stone and soil by countless iterations of this same journey. Somewhere ahead, my car waited in a parking lot that might or might not exist. Somewhere behind, another version of myself was just beginning to understand the true nature of being lost. And on my wrist, my grandfather's watch ticked steadily forward, marking time in a place where time had forgotten how to move in straight lines. The mountains kept their secrets, and I was becoming one of them. Story 9. The highway stretched ahead like a black tongue licking at the darkness, and I should have known better than to stop. But fatigue had been clawing at my eyelids for the past hour, turning the dotted yellow lines into a hypnotic blur that threatened to pull me into the ditch. The rest area appeared suddenly in my headlights. A concrete island floating in an ocean of nothing, marked by a weathered sign that read, "Pine Grove Rest Stop," in letters so faded they seemed more suggestion than fact. I pulled off the main road, gravel crunching beneath my tires like broken teeth. The parking area was nothing more than a semicircle of cracked asphalt surrounded by towering pines that swayed in the October wind, their branches creaking with an almost human quality. No streetlights, no other cars. Just the pale wash of my headlights carving out a small sphere of visibility in the absolute darkness that pressed against the windows like something alive and hungry. The engine's rumble died to a whisper when I shifted into park, and suddenly the silence was deafening. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping countryside, but something heavier. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small sounds of your body that usually disappear into the background noise of living. I checked my phone. No signal. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:47 a.m. in cold blue numerals that seemed to float in the darkness. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, fleeing the wreckage of another failed relationship, another job that had consumed me from the inside out. The plan was simple: drive through the night, reach my brother's place by dawn, start over again. It was a plan I had executed before, would probably execute again, because starting over had become my specialty, my particular talent for avoiding the uncomfortable weight of permanence. The October air bit at my skin when I stepped out to stretch my legs. The forest around the rest area felt ancient and watchful, filled with the kind of shadows that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. Pine needles carpeted the ground, muffling my footsteps as I walked toward the single picnic table that sat at the edge of the light. The wood was damp with dew and cold enough to sting my palms when I leaned against it. That's when I heard them, voices drifting through the trees like smoke. Young voices, conversational and casual, completely at odds with the isolation of this place. I turned toward the sound, squinting into the darkness beyond my car's reach, but saw nothing except the vertical lines of pine trunks disappearing into shadow. They emerged from the tree line like figures stepping out of a photograph, materializing so gradually that I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment they became real. Two of them, walking side by side with the easy confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. Both wore identical uniforms, navy blazers with crested patches, khaki slacks, the kind of formal attire that marked them as students from one of those expensive preparatory schools where teenagers learn to speak in complete sentences and shake hands with eye contact. But something was wrong with the picture. The uniforms were pristine, as if they had just stepped out of a catalog, showing no signs of the walk through the forest that should have left them covered in pine needles and dirt. Their faces were clean and unmarked, their hair perfectly styled despite the wind that had been bending the trees since I arrived. They couldn't have been walking through those woods, yet there was nowhere else they could have come from. The taller one, blonde hair swept back from a face that belonged in a yearbook photo, raised his hand in greeting. His companion, darker-haired with features that seemed to shift slightly in the uncertain light, smiled with teeth that looked too white, too perfect. They approached my car with purpose, as if they had been expecting me. The blonde one did most of the talking, his voice carrying that particular blend of entitlement and politeness that expensive education tends to produce. They needed a ride, he explained, just as far as the light would take them. Something about their car breaking down, about being stranded, about needing to get back to campus before morning check-in. The details felt rehearsed, delivered with the smooth confidence of a well-practiced speech. But when I tried to focus on the specifics, they seemed to slip away like water through my fingers. I should have said no. Every instinct I possessed was screaming warnings, flooding my system with adrenaline that made my hands shake and my pulse race. But they were polite, well-dressed, obviously from good families, the kind of people who belonged in nice places, who had never learned to fear the darkness because they had never needed to. Refusing seemed not just rude but cruel, like abandoning injured animals on the side of the road. So I unlocked the doors and watched them settle into my back seat with movements that were too smooth, too coordinated, as if they were performing a dance they had rehearsed countless times. The taller one sat directly behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat of his breath on the back of my neck. His companion took the seat behind the passenger side, positioning himself where I could see him in the rearview mirror if I tilted it just right. The car felt different with them inside it, smaller somehow, the air thicker and harder to breathe. Their presence filled the space with an electricity that made my skin crawl, like the feeling you get just before a thunderstorm when the very atmosphere seems to hold its breath. I adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at them, but the reflection seemed wrong somehow, as if the mirror was showing me something slightly different from what my eyes saw when I turned around. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, the headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. In the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of my passengers, fragments of faces that never quite assembled into complete pictures. The blonde one's reflection seemed to flicker, like a television with poor reception, while the other remained unnaturally still, so motionless that I began to wonder if he was breathing at all. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. Usually, passengers felt obligated to make conversation, to fill the space with small talk about the weather or their destination. But these two sat in perfect quiet, their presence radiating a kind of patient waiting that made my nerves sing with tension. I could feel them watching me, their eyes tracking my movements with predatory focus. Desperate to break the suffocating quiet, I reached for the radio. The button clicked under my finger with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Static burst from the speakers, not the usual white noise of empty frequencies, but something more complex, more deliberate. It rose and fell in patterns that almost resembled speech, crackling with an intelligence that made the hair on my arm stand up. And then I heard it. Buried in the static, barely audible beneath the electronic hiss, were voices. The same voices that had asked me for a ride, speaking in perfect unison with words I couldn't quite understand, but that sent ice water through my veins. The sound wasn't coming from any radio station. It was coming from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that existed in the space between frequencies, in the gaps where normal signals feared to go. I fumbled for the volume control, my hands shaking as I tried to turn it down, but the voices only grew louder, clearer, more insistent. They were saying my name now, repeating it like a mantra, like a prayer, like an incantation designed to strip away everything I thought I knew about reality. The static began to take on rhythm, pulsing in time with my heartbeat, synchronizing with the blood rushing through my ears. Behind me, I could hear my passengers beginning to speak, their voices blending perfectly with the sounds coming from the radio. They were saying the same words in the same cadence, creating a harmony that shouldn't have been possible, but that filled the car with a sound like wind through broken glass, like whispers in an empty room, like the last breath leaving a dying world. My hand slammed down on the radio, killing the power with violent desperation. The sudden silence was like a physical blow, leaving my ears ringing and my vision spotted with phantom lights. I gasped for air, only then realizing that I had been holding my breath, my lungs burning with the effort of trying not to breathe in whatever poison they had been broadcasting. I turned around to confront them, to demand answers, to reassert some measure of control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond my understanding. The back seat was empty. Not just empty, pristine. The upholstery showed no indentation where they had been sitting, no warmth lingering from their bodies, no evidence that anyone had ever been there at all. The air still held that electric charge, that sense of presence that made my skin crawl, but they were gone as completely as if they had never existed. I pulled over, tires squealing against asphalt as I yanked the wheel to the right. The car lurched to a stop on the shoulder, and I sat there in the sudden stillness, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps that fogged the windshield, and I had to fight the urge to vomit as my mind tried to process what had just happened. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the fatigue had been worse than I thought, causing me to hallucinate passengers who had never been there in the first place. Maybe the radio had simply picked up some strange interference, atmospheric disturbance that my exhausted brain had interpreted as something more sinister than it actually was. But then I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The trees outside my windows were passing by backward. I looked down at the gear shift, saw the little R glowing softly in the dashboard light, realized with growing horror that I was in reverse. Had been in reverse. For how long? How far had I driven backward down a dark highway without realizing it? How had I not noticed the landscape moving in the wrong direction, the way the headlights should have been illuminating the road behind me instead of ahead? I shifted into park with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, my mind reeling as I tried to understand how this was possible. You don't accidentally drive in reverse for miles without knowing it. You don't fail to notice that the entire world is moving the wrong way around you. It was physically impossible, like forgetting to breathe or failing to notice that you were walking on your hands instead of your feet. But I had been doing exactly that, guiding the car smoothly backward along a highway I couldn't see, navigating curves and hills with precision that should have been impossible, as if something else had been controlling my hands, my feet, my perception of direction and space and time. I forced myself to get out of the car, to walk around it, and confirm what my instruments were telling me. The front bumper was pointing toward the forest, the headlights casting their beam into a wall of pine trees that shouldn't have been there. Behind me, the highway stretched away into darkness, and I could see the fresh tire tracks in the dirt, where I had somehow backed off the road and onto the shoulder without hitting anything, without running into the ditch, without crashing into the trees that crowded the edge of the pavement. The tracks were perfectly straight, as if laid down by a machine rather than a human driver. They showed no sign of the erratic weaving that should have resulted from someone trying to navigate backward in the dark. Instead, they formed a precise line that spoke of inhuman control, of guidance from something that could see in directions I couldn't, that understood the landscape in ways that my limited human perception never could. I got back in the car and turned it around, my movements mechanical and deliberate, as I tried to impose some sense of normalcy on a situation that had moved completely beyond the boundaries of normal experience. The engine started without hesitation. The headlights carved their familiar cone of visibility into the darkness ahead, and for a moment I almost convinced myself that everything was returning to some semblance of sanity. But as I pulled back onto the highway, I noticed something else that shouldn't have been possible. The digital clock on the dashboard still read 2:47 a.m., exactly the same time it had shown when I first stopped at the rest area. According to the car's systems, no time had passed at all. Not for the conversation with the two figures in school uniforms, not for the drive with them in my back seat, not for the minutes I had spent in reverse traveling backward through the darkness, not for the time I had sat on the shoulder trying to understand what was happening to me. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was haunting that stretch of highway. The speedometer climbed past 70, past 80, the engine roaring with the effort of escape. But in the rearview mirror, I could see something that made my hands tighten on the wheel until my fingers ached. The rest area was still there, its single picnic table visible in the red glow of my taillights, growing smaller but never quite disappearing, no matter how fast I drove, No matter how many miles the odometer claimed I was covering, the Pine Grove rest stop remained stubbornly present in my mirror, as if I were driving away from it and toward it simultaneously, caught in some impossible loop that defied every law of physics and geography I had ever learned. And standing beside the picnic table, barely visible in the dying light, were two figures in dark uniforms. They weren't moving, weren't waving, weren't doing anything except watching my retreat with the patient attention of people who knew exactly where I was going and exactly when I would return. Because I would return. The certainty of it settled into my bones like a tumor, growing with each mile I traveled away from them. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning of something that had been waiting for me my entire life. Something that had finally found me alone and vulnerable on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere. The radio remained silent, but I could feel its presence like a loaded gun, waiting for the moment when I would inevitably reach for it again, when the silence would become too much to bear, and I would need to hear something, anything, even if that something was the sound of my own voice coming back to me from the spaces between the stars. The clock still read 2:47 a.m., and I was beginning to suspect it always would. Miles passed beneath my tires, or perhaps the same mile repeated endlessly, and I drove through the darkness toward a destination I wasn't sure existed, carrying passengers I couldn't see but could still feel breathing on the back of my neck, their voices echoing in the static between thoughts, between heartbeats, between the moments when I was still certain of the difference between what was real and what was waiting for me in the place where the light ends and the true journey begins. Story 10. The inheritance papers arrived on a Tuesday, along with keys that felt heavier than they should have. My uncle's winery sat 40 miles from civilization, surrounded by hills that rolled like sleeping giants under a perpetually overcast sky. The estate agent's description had been generous. Rustic charm was how she'd phrased it. Standing before the weathered stone building with its broken shutters hanging like damaged eyelids, I understood that charm had abandoned this place long ago. The front door groaned as it swung open, releasing air that tasted of fermented grapes and something else, something that coated my tongue with metallic bitterness. My footsteps echoed through empty corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to track my movement. The faces were unfamiliar, yet each one stirred an uncomfortable recognition, as if I'd seen them in dreams I couldn't quite remember. The main cellar stretched beneath the building like a cathedral of wine. Massive wooden barrels lined the stone walls, their surfaces dark with age and moisture. Cobwebs draped from the vaulted ceiling like funeral shrouds, and the air hung thick with the scent of oak and decay. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows upon rows of containers that had once held my uncle's finest vintages. It was between two particularly large barrels that I found her. The porcelain doll sat upright against the stone wall, her back pressed against the cool surface as if she'd been placed there deliberately. Her dress, once white, had yellowed to the color of old bones, but it was her face that made my breath catch. A spider web of hairline cracks spread across her cheek like frozen lightning, creating shadows that shifted in my flashlight beam. Her eyes, painted blue with meticulous care, stared directly at me with an intensity that seemed impossible for an inanimate object. I approached slowly, my feet creating soft scuffing sounds against the earthen floor. The doll was larger than expected, nearly 2 feet tall, and beautifully crafted despite the damage. Her hair, real human hair by the feel of it, had been arranged in careful ringlets that still held their shape after what must have been years in this damp cellar. When I lifted her, she was surprisingly light, as if hollow. A gentle shake confirmed my suspicion. Something rattled inside her head. Not the typical sound of broken pottery, but liquid. A soft sloshing that reminded me of wine swirling in a glass. Setting her aside, I turned my attention to the barrels. Most were empty, their contents long since evaporated or spoiled. But one, a massive oak cask positioned directly behind where I'd found the doll, still held liquid. The brass spigot at its base gleamed as if recently polished, free of the tarnish that covered everything else in the cellar. I gripped the barrel's edge and gave it an experimental shake. The liquid inside responded with a deep, resonant slosh that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. But within that echo, just at the edge of perception, I heard something else. Words, Latin words, spoken in a voice that was neither male nor female, young nor old. Descendit per gradus lapideos. He descends by stone steps. The words formed in my mind unbidden, a translation I shouldn't have known. I'd never studied Latin beyond a few phrases encountered in legal documents, yet the meaning was crystal clear. More disturbing was the accuracy. I had indeed descended stone steps to reach this cellar. I shook the barrel again, harder this time. Invenit puellam inter dolia. He finds the girl among the vessels. My hands released the barrel's edge as if burned. The echo faded into silence, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stared at the doll, at her cracked face and knowing eyes, and felt the first cold tendril of fear wrap around my spine. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Old pipes carrying sound from elsewhere in the building. The acoustics of the cellar creating auditory illusions. Stress and fatigue manifesting as hallucinations after the long drive and emotional weight of dealing with my uncle's estate. But rationality felt thin in this place, like morning mist before a harsh sun. I decided to test the phenomenon systematically, approaching it like the engineering problems I solved in my day job. If I could understand it, I could control it. If I could control it, I wouldn't need to fear it. The next shake produced different words. Audet experiri quod non debet. He dares to test what he should not. A chill ran down my arms. The voice seemed closer now, emanating not just from the barrel but from the walls themselves. I glanced around the cellar, suddenly aware of how the shadows seemed to move independently of my flashlight beam. The portraits upstairs had prepared me for the sensation of being watched, but here it felt more immediate, more intimate. I forced myself to continue the experiment. Each movement of the barrel produced new Latin phrases, each one describing my actions with unsettling precision. When I walked to the far end of the cellar, ambulat ad terminum cavernae. When I examined the wine racks, inspicit loculos vacuos. When I touched the stone walls, tangit parietes antiquos. The voice never wavered, never showed emotion. It simply narrated my movements with the detached precision of a court reporter documenting proceedings. But the accumulation of these observations created a weight in my chest, a growing certainty that something was recording my every action for reasons I couldn't fathom. Hours passed. The battery in my flashlight began to dim, casting weaker circles of light that made the shadows seem more aggressive. I should have left. Should have returned to my hotel room and come back in daylight with proper equipment and maybe another person for company. Instead, I found myself drawn deeper into the mystery. The wine rack held a dozen bottles of my uncle's final vintage, their labels reading Estate Reserve 1987 in elegant script. The glass was thick and dark, making it impossible to see the liquid within. I selected one bottle and worked the cork free with a tool I'd found among the winery equipment. The wine poured like liquid midnight, so dark it absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Its aroma was complex, leather and tobacco, and something floral that I couldn't identify. When I raised the glass to my lips, the first sip flooded my mouth with flavors that seemed to tell stories. Rich fruit gave way to earth and mineral notes, but underneath it all was something else, something that tasted like memory itself. I took another sip, then another. With each taste, the cellar seemed to shift around me. Colors became more vivid despite the dim light. Sounds grew sharper, more distinct. Even the air felt different against my skin, charged with an electricity that made my hair stand on end. It was then that I noticed the wine in my glass beginning to evaporate. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow persistence of morning dew under a rising sun. Tiny wisps of vapor rose from the surface, carrying with them the complex aromatics of the vintage. I watched, mesmerized, as the level in my glass dropped incrementally with each evaporated molecule, and the doll's eyes began to glow. Not with light, but with something deeper, a warmth that seemed to emanate from behind the painted irises, as if someone had lit a candle inside her hollow head. The cracks in her porcelain face caught this inner radiance, creating a pattern of luminous veins that pulsed in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I set down the wine glass and approached her slowly. Up close, I could see moisture condensing on the inside of her eyes, the same moisture that had evaporated from my glass. The liquid moved with purpose, swirling in patterns that hypnotized and disturbed in equal measure. Bibere memorias. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, drinking memories. I jerked back, nearly stumbling over my own feet. The Latin phrase echoed in the confined space, repeating until the words lost meaning and became pure sound. But I understood its implications. The wine wasn't just evaporating, it was being transferred, carrying with it something more than mere liquid. My memories. The realization hit me like ice water. Each sip of wine had felt familiar not because of its taste, but because it contained pieces of my own experience. Fragments of conversations, glimpses of faces, the emotional weight of moments I'd thought forgotten. The doll wasn't just collecting the evaporated wine, she was distilling the essence of my consciousness. I grabbed the glass and drained it in one desperate gulp, hoping to reclaim what had been taken. The wine burned my throat, thick and viscous as if it had been aging inside my own memories. But instead of satisfaction, I felt only a deeper sense of loss. The liquid was different now, changed by its brief imprisonment in porcelain and painted eyes. The barrel began sloshing without any movement from me. The sound grew rhythmic, hypnotic, like a massive heartbeat echoing through the stone chamber. With each pulse, new Latin phrases filled the air. Quod semel exhalatum, numquam reddit. What once exhaled never returns. Memoria in vitro carcerum facit. Memory in glass makes a prison. Puella novit quae fuerat, quae est, quae erit. The girl knows what was, what is, what will be. I backed toward the cellar stairs, but found my feet reluctant to obey. The doll held my gaze with her luminous eyes, and I felt the last fragments of the wine evaporating from my system. But instead of leaving my body entirely, the vapor seemed to linger in the air around me, creating a visible trail that connected my breath to her waiting face. More bottles appeared on the wine rack, bottles that hadn't been there moments before. My uncle's entire collection, stretching back decades, each one labeled with a different year. But as I looked closer, I realized the dates weren't production years. They were calendar years, recent ones, extending right up to the present day. The bottle I'd opened bore yesterday's date. Understanding crashed over me like a cold wave. I wasn't the first person to discover this cellar, to find the doll, to drink the wine. Others had come before me, lured by inheritance papers or curiosity or simple misfortune. Each had contributed their essence to the collection, their memories distilled and stored in dark glass bottles for reasons I couldn't begin to comprehend. And now I was adding my own vintage to the reserve. The doll's mouth moved, just slightly, just enough to notice. Her painted lips curved into what might have been a smile, or might have been preparation for speech. The moisture inside her eyes swirled faster, creating tiny whirlpools that reflected my flashlight beam in impossible ways. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, waterlogged. Each step required enormous effort, as if I were moving through thick liquid rather than air. The cellar stretched before me, longer than it had been when I'd first descended. The stairs seemed miles away, receding even as I struggled toward them. Behind me, the barrel's rhythm intensified. The Latin phrases came faster now, overlapping until they formed a chant that seemed to originate from the stone walls themselves. The doll's glow brightened, casting shifting shadows that danced across the curved ceiling like living things. I reached the stairs and began climbing, my hand gripping the stone railing for support. Each step felt like a small victory, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger. At the top, I burst through the cellar door and into the main house, slamming it behind me with enough force to rattle the walls. Silence. No Latin phrases, no rhythmic sloshing, no sound at all except my own labored breathing and the frantic beating of my heart. I leaned against the door, feeling the solid wood against my back, and tried to convince myself that I'd escaped whatever had been happening in that cellar. But when I looked down at my hands, I saw tiny drops of wine still clinging to my fingers. Dark liquid that shouldn't have been there, that I was certain I'd wiped away. And as I watched, the drops began to evaporate, rising from my skin in thin spirals of vapor that drifted toward the cellar door, toward the cracks beneath it, toward the waiting doll below. I stumbled through the house and out into the night air, desperate for space and sky and anything that wasn't confined stone and watching eyes. The stars above seemed dimmer than they should have been, filtered through a haze that might have been clouds, or might have been something else entirely. My car waited in the gravel driveway, keys still in my pocket, escape still possible. But as I reached for the door handle, I caught my reflection in the window glass and saw tiny cracks spreading across my face, hairline fractures, just like the ones on the doll's porcelain cheek. They spread slowly but persistently, creating a web of damage that mapped perfectly onto my features. When I touched them, my fingers came away with moisture, wine-dark liquid that evaporated even as I tried to wipe it clean. I drove away from the winery as fast as the narrow mountain roads would allow, checking my rearview mirror obsessively for signs of pursuit. But nothing followed me except my own thoughts, circling endlessly around questions I couldn't answer. Had the experience been real? A hallucination brought on by stress and isolation? Some kind of chemical reaction from drinking wine that had been stored improperly for decades? The cracks on my face faded as I put distance between myself and the cellar, disappearing entirely by the time I reached my hotel. But I could still taste wine on my tongue, still hear the echo of Latin phrases in the quiet moments before sleep. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I caught glimpses of porcelain eyes watching me with patient intensity. The inheritance papers are still in my briefcase. The winery still waits among its rolling hills, patient and persistent as erosion. I tell myself I'll sell it, have it demolished, find some way to bury the mystery along with the building. But I know I'll return. The doll has something of mine now, something distilled from memory and breath and the essence of being human. And I have something of hers, the knowledge of what waits in that cellar, the understanding that some inheritances come with prices that can't be calculated in dollars or time. Late at night, when sleep refuses to come, I taste wine on my lips and hear the soft sloshing of liquid in oak barrels. Latin phrases whisper at the edge of consciousness, describing actions I haven't taken yet, places I haven't gone, but will. Revertetur ad puellum. He will return to the girl. The translation forms in my mind with perfect clarity, and I know it's true. The doll waits with infinite patience, her hollow head growing heavier with each drop of collected memory. And somewhere in the dark cellar, new bottles appear on the wine rack, each one labeled with a future date, each one waiting to be filled. Story 11. The graveled road to St. Bartholomew's colony stretched like a scar across the Montana wilderness, each mile taking me further from anything resembling civilization. My van's engine coughed against the thin mountain air as I navigated the final switchback, and there it was, a cluster of weathered wooden buildings huddled against the mountainside like survivors of some forgotten catastrophe. The colony appeared abandoned at first glance. Paint peeled from the chapel's white facade in long, curling strips, and weeds pushed through cracks in the courtyard's flagstones. Only the thin ribbon of smoke rising from the rectory's chimney suggested any human presence at all. I parked beside a rusted water pump and stepped out into the oppressive silence. Brother Marcus emerged from the rectory before I could knock, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. His handshake felt like grasping dry kindling. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for coming so far. We weren't certain anyone would accept the commission." I hefted my toolbox and followed him toward the chapel. "Your message mentioned the organ was built in 1847. That makes it worth the trip, regardless of its condition." "Yes, well." Marcus paused at the chapel door, his fingers worrying the iron key. "It hasn't been played in some time. The last of our congregation departed 6 months ago. Only myself and Brother Thomas remain now." The chapel's interior struck me like a physical blow. Dust motes danced in shafts of colored light from the stained glass windows, and the air tasted of decades of incense and neglect. But it was the organ that dominated the space, a magnificent instrument with 3 manual keyboards and dozens of wooden pipes rising toward the vaulted ceiling like the ribcage of some great beast. I set down my tools and approached the console, running my fingers along the yellowed ivory keys, several depressed with no sound. The action was completely seized. When was it last maintained? Brother Theodore tended to it until his passing 3 years ago. Since then, Marcus spread his hands helplessly. None of us possessed his knowledge. I opened my leather journal and began noting the obvious problems: seized action, corroded pipework, what appeared to be significant wind leakage. The restoration would take weeks, possibly months. I'll need to stay on site. The nearest motel is over an hour away. Of course, Brother Thomas has prepared the guest quarters. You'll find them adequate. Something in his tone made me look up, but Marcus was already walking away, his footsteps echoing in the empty nave. The guest quarters occupied the second floor of a narrow building behind the chapel. The room was spartanly furnished: a narrow bed, a wooden desk, a single window overlooking the courtyard. But it was clean, and the radiator worked, which was more than I'd expected. I spent the remainder of that first day assessing the organ's condition. The instrument was indeed magnificent, German craftsmanship from the mid-19th century, with tone qualities that would be impossible to replicate today. But the damage was extensive. Leather pneumatics had cracked and hardened, metal pipes showed signs of corrosion, and decades of mountain dampness had warped several wooden components beyond repair. As evening approached, I found myself alone in the chapel. Marcus and Thomas had vanished after providing a simple dinner, offering no explanation for their absence. The building's acoustics fascinated me. Even my footsteps seemed to linger in the air longer than they should. I pulled out my journal and began planning the restoration sequence, noting which hymns I would use to test each rank of pipes as I brought them back to life. The first hymn would be "Holy, Holy, Holy," a simple melody that would test the principal stops. Then, "Come, Thou Fount," perfect for evaluating the flute work. I filled 3 pages with detailed notes, cross-referencing pipe measurements with the original German documentation I'd found tucked behind the console. Darkness fell while I worked, and I finally switched on my LED flashlight when the natural light became insufficient. The beam cut through the chapel's gloom, illuminating dust and shadows in equal measure. I was just closing my journal when I heard it. Singing. The voices seemed to come from just beyond the chapel's main doors, a full congregation singing "Holy, Holy, Holy" in perfect 4-part harmony. The melody rose and fell with practiced precision, each voice distinct yet blending seamlessly with the others. I could hear individual vibrato in the soprano line, the rich resonance of the bass voices, the way the tenors ornament the final phrase. But that was impossible. Marcus had said the congregation was gone. I called out, but received no response. The singing continued, now transitioning into "Come, Thou Fount," the second hymn on my list. My hands trembled as I approached the heavy wooden doors and pressed my ear against them. The voices were definitely coming from the other side, clear as if I were standing among the singers. I grasped the iron handles and pulled. The doors opened onto an empty courtyard bathed in moonlight. The singing stopped instantly, as if someone had thrown a switch. No retreating footsteps, no rustle of clothing, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. Even the night sounds of the mountain, wind through trees, the distant call of an owl, seemed muted, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I stepped outside, my flashlight beam sweeping across the flagstones. Nothing. No signs of disturbance, no indication that dozens of people had been gathered here moments before. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. Back in my quarters, I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. Sound could carry strangely in mountain terrain. Perhaps there was another religious community nearby, their evening service somehow echoing off the rock formations. But that didn't explain how they had known the exact hymns I'd listed in my journal. or why the singing had stopped so abruptly when I opened the doors. I lay in bed listening to the building settle around me. Old wood creaked and whispered in the darkness, and more than once I thought I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my room. But whenever I turned on my flashlight to investigate, I found only empty hallway stretching toward the stairs. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of empty pews filled with shifting shadows. The next several days fell into a routine. I worked on the organ during daylight hours, methodically cleaning and repairing each component. Marcus and Thomas appeared occasionally, bringing meals or offering cryptic observations about the weather, but they seemed more like phantoms than companions, present one moment, gone the next without explanation. The organ slowly began to respond to my ministrations. I managed to restore wind pressure to several ranks of pipes, and by the fourth day I could coax primitive melodies from the principal stops. The sound filled the chapel with rich, resonant tones that seemed to awaken the building itself. Dust drifted down from the rafters, and I could swear the stained glass windows grew brighter, as if the music were feeding some deep hunger in the structure. But it was the nights that truly haunted me. Every evening, as soon as darkness fell and I switched on my flashlight to continue working, the singing would begin. Always the same location, just beyond the chapel doors. Always the same repertoire, the exact hymns I had listed in my journal, performed in the precise order I had written them down. The voices never deviated from my planned sequence, even when I deliberately altered my notes during the day. I began experimenting. One evening I added "A Mighty Fortress" to my list, writing it in the margin of my journal page. That night, the invisible congregation sang it perfectly, complete with the traditional German harmonization I had specified in my notes. When I crossed out "Come, thou fount," and replaced it with "When I survey the wondrous cross," the singers adjusted their repertoire accordingly. They were reading my journal. Somehow, impossibly, they knew exactly what I had written before I had even played a single note. I started keeping the journal with me at all times, but it made no difference. The singers always knew. They anticipated every change, every addition, every modification to my planned testing sequence. It was as if they existed in some temporal space adjacent to my own, where future and past collapsed into a single eternal moment of performance. The footprints appeared on the seventh night. I had grown bold enough to turn off my flashlight while the singing occurred, standing in the chapel's darkness and listening to the impossible chorus. The music seemed more vivid in the blackness. I could distinguish individual voices, hear the soft intake of breath before each phrase, even detect the subtle rustle of clothing as bodies swayed with the rhythm. When "O Sacred Head Now Wounded" concluded, I waited for the familiar silence before switching my light back on. The beam illuminated the chapel floor, and I nearly dropped the flashlight in shock. Footprints covered the polished wooden planks, dozens of them, all barefoot, still gleaming wet against the dark wood. They clustered around the pews in natural congregation patterns, some overlapping where people had shifted position during the singing. The prints were fresh, so fresh that I could see individual toe marks and the distinctive arch patterns unique to each foot. I knelt and touched one of the prints. My finger came away damp. But the chapel had been empty. I had stood in complete darkness for over 20 minutes, and no one had entered through the main doors. The side entrances were locked. I had checked them myself days earlier. The prints simply couldn't exist, yet here they were, undeniable evidence that something had been in the chapel with me. I followed the trail of footprints to the front of the chapel, where they clustered around the organ console. Several sets of prints suggested that people had stood directly behind the bench where I worked each day, watching over my shoulder as I made repairs. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. By morning, the prints had vanished without a trace. I confronted Marcus at breakfast, demanding an explanation. He listened to my account with the same hollow expression he wore for everything, occasionally nodding as if my words confirmed something he already knew. The faithful do not abandon their devotions merely because their bodies have found rest, he said finally. This has always been a place of worship. Perhaps some echoes linger. Echoes don't leave footprints, I replied. Marcus shrugged and returned to his porridge. The mountain plays strange tricks with sound and shadow. Brother Theodore used to speak of similar phenomena. What happened to Brother Theodore? He completed his service to God. Marcus stood and cleared his bowl, as we all must, in time. That afternoon, I attempted to research the colony's history, but found precious little information. St. Bartholomew's had been established in 1847 by a splinter group from a German religious sect, dedicated to what they called perpetual devotion, continuous worship and contemplation removed from worldly distractions. The original congregation had numbered nearly 200 souls, but membership had dwindled steadily over the decades as the outside world encroached upon their isolation. What disturbed me was a newspaper clipping I found tucked into one of the theological texts in the rectory library. The article, dated 6 months earlier, reported the mysterious disappearance of the colony's remaining 63 residents. Local authorities had found the buildings empty, meals still warm on tables, no signs of struggle or forced departure. The article quoted Sheriff Brennan describing it as, like they all just got up and walked into the wilderness. But Marcus had said the congregation departed, past tense, suggesting a planned exodus. He hadn't mentioned anything about disappearances or investigations. I found Marcus in the vegetable garden behind the rectory, tending to rows of withered plants that clearly hadn't been watered in weeks. When I showed him the newspaper clipping, his face revealed nothing. The secular authorities rarely understand the nature of spiritual calling, he said without looking up from the dead tomato vines. Brother Thomas and I remained to maintain the sacred space until its purpose could be fulfilled. What purpose? Every instrument of worship must find its voice. The organ has been silent too long. His words carried an undertone that made my skin crawl, but before I could press for clarification, he had shambled away toward the rectory, leaving me alone among the dying plants. That night, I made a decision that would haunt me for months afterward. Instead of working in the chapel until darkness fell, I positioned myself outside the building before sunset, hidden behind the water pump where I could observe the entire courtyard. If the singers were somehow entering the chapel without my knowledge, I would catch them in the act. The sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks, and twilight deepened into full darkness. I waited, barely breathing, my eyes fixed on the chapel doors. Nothing moved in the courtyard. No figures approached the building. The silence stretched on until my legs cramped from crouching behind the pump. Then the singing began. The voices rose from inside the chapel, full, rich, and impossibly present. I could hear them as clearly as if I were sitting in the front pew. Holy, holy, holy filled the night air, each voice distinct and perfect. But the chapel remained empty. I had been watching the doors continuously, and no one had entered. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I approached the building. The singing continued unabated. They were performing "Come Thou Fount" now, the harmony more complex than any human choir could achieve. I pressed my face against the stained glass window beside the door, but the beam revealed only empty pews and dust motes dancing in the colored light. I opened the door. The singing stopped instantly, but this time I didn't need to turn on my flashlight to see the footprints. They gleamed wetly in the moonlight streaming through the windows. Dozens of them, still fresh, still damp, arranged in perfect rows, as if a full congregation had been singing just moments before. But I had been watching. The chapel had been empty when the singing began, empty throughout the entire performance, and empty when I entered. The footprints existed without the feet that had made them, evidence of presence without substance, proof of an impossible congregation that sang without breath and walked without bodies. I backed out of the chapel and ran to my quarters, my heart hammering against my ribs. The journal lay open on my desk, and in the margin beside, "Come Thou Fount," someone had written in spidery handwriting. "Beautifully done. The restoration proceeds well." The ink was still wet. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by my window watching the chapel, waiting for some sign of the presence that haunted it. But the building remained dark and still, giving no hint of the impossible congregation that gathered within its walls each evening. By morning, I had made my decision. The organ was nearly functional. A few more days of work would complete the basic restoration. I would finish the job and leave immediately, before whatever force inhabited this place could extend its influence any further. But the organ had other plans. As I worked that final day, bringing the last rank of pipes back to life, the instrument seemed to respond with more than mere mechanical obedience. The touch became more sensitive, the tone richer and more complex than 18th century craftsmanship should have allowed. When I tested the full registration, the sound that filled the chapel was nothing short of magnificent, layer upon layer of harmony that seemed to draw resonance from the very stones of the building. I found myself playing longer than necessary, exploring the organ's newly restored voice. The music seemed to flow through my fingers without conscious effort, as if the instrument itself were guiding the performance. Hymns I had planned to test individually blended seamlessly into a continuous worship service, each piece flowing naturally into the next. The sun set while I played, but I didn't stop to turn on my flashlight. The music was too beautiful, too perfect to interrupt with mundane concerns about illumination. Besides, I knew every key and stopped by touch now. I could play in complete darkness if necessary. It was only when I finally lifted my hands from the keyboard that I realized I was no longer alone. The singing began immediately, picking up the melody exactly where I had left off. But this time it came from inside the chapel, all around me, as if I were sitting in the center of a vast choir. Individual voices surrounded me on every side, some so close I could feel the warmth of breath against my neck. The harmony was impossibly complex, with more vocal parts than any human choir could manage. I sat frozen at the organ bench, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to acknowledge what was happening around me. The singers continued their performance, and gradually I became aware of other sounds. The rustle of clothing, the soft shuffling of feet, the occasional cough or whispered "Amen." The chapel was full of worshippers who cast no shadows and reflected no light. When the hymn concluded, a voice spoke directly behind me, a man's voice, warm and familiar, despite being impossible. "Thank you, Brother Hayes. Theodore would have been pleased." I spun around, but my flashlight beam revealed only empty pews. The voice had been close enough that I should have been able to touch the speaker, but nothing stood behind the organ bench except dust and shadow. "Who are you?" I whispered to the darkness. "The faithful," came the reply, though I couldn't pinpoint its source. "We have been waiting for the music to return." "You're dead." The words escaped before I could stop them. Laughter rippled through the chapel, not malicious, but genuinely amused. "Death is merely another form of devotion, Brother Hayes. The body may rest, but the spirit continues its worship." I fumbled for my journal, desperate for some anchor to reality. The pages fell open to my restoration notes, but new writing covered the margins, dozens of different hands thanking me for my work, commenting on specific repairs, offering suggestions for future maintenance, all in fresh ink that gleamed wetly in my flashlight beam. "You've been watching me work," I managed. "We have been learning," the voice replied. "The organ must be played properly, with full understanding of its sacred purpose. You have taught us much." The implications struck me like a physical blow. They weren't just observers, they were students, learning from my techniques, absorbing my knowledge. "But why?" "Brother Thomas tells us you plan to leave tomorrow," the voice continued. "This troubles us greatly. I've completed the restoration. My work here is finished." "No, Brother Hayes, your work here has only just begun." The temperature in the chapel seemed to drop 20 degrees. My breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began forming on the metal pipes of the organ. The voice, when it spoke again, carried a note of profound sadness. "The faithful require leadership in their devotions. We have waited so long for someone with your gifts, your understanding of the sacred music. You cannot abandon us now." I stood from the organ bench, backing toward the main doors. "I'm leaving in the morning. The organ is functional, that's what you hired me for." "We hired you for much more than mere mechanical repair," the voice said. And now other voices joined it, dozens of them, all speaking in unison. "We hired you to complete our congregation." The chapel doors slammed shut behind me with a sound like thunder. I grabbed the handles and pulled, but they wouldn't budge. The metal felt ice cold against my palms, and when I shone my flashlight on them, I could see frost spreading across the iron hinges. "Let me out!" I shouted, but my voice seemed to disappear into the vastness of the chapel without producing any echo. "Play for us, Brother Hayes," the unified voice commanded. "Take your place at the console and lead us in worship." I pressed my back against the locked doors and swept my flashlight across the chapel. The beam revealed nothing but empty pews and shadows, yet I could feel their presence everywhere. Watching, waiting, hoping. The invisible congregation filled every corner of the space, their anticipation so thick I could almost taste it. "I won't," I whispered. The organ began playing by itself. The melody was "Holy, Holy, Holy," the first hymn on my original list, but the performance was flawless in a way that transcended human capability. Every note rang with perfect pitch and timing, the registration changes occurring with supernatural precision. The music filled the chapel with such beauty that it brought tears to my eyes despite my terror. The singing began on the second verse, hundreds of voices joining in perfect harmony. The sound was overwhelming, not loud, but incredibly dense, as if every person who had ever worshipped in this chapel across its century and a half of existence were present and contributing their voice to the performance. And gradually, involuntarily, I found myself moving toward the organ console. The music was too beautiful to resist. Each step felt natural, inevitable, as if I were simply returning to my proper place in the sacred order. The bench welcomed me like an old friend, and my hands found the keys without conscious thought. I was playing now, adding my own voice to the impossible chorus, and the rightness of it was overwhelming. This was why I had come. Not to repair a broken instrument, but to complete a broken congregation. The faithful had been waiting, not for months or years, but for decades, for someone who could bridge the gap between their eternal devotion and the mechanical requirements of worship. They needed a living musician to give voice to their praise, just as they offered their spectral presence to give meaning to the music. The arrangement was perfect, symbiotic, beautiful. I played through the entire service, each hymn flowing seamlessly into the next. The congregation sang with increasing joy, their voices blending with mine in harmonies that human voices could never achieve alone. Time ceased to have meaning. We might have been playing for minutes or hours or days. All that mattered was the music and the perfect unity it created between the living and the dead. When the final hymn concluded, the chapel fell silent. I sat at the console in the darkness, my hands still resting on the keys, waiting for instruction about what came next. "Welcome, Brother Hayes," the familiar voice said. "We are complete now." The temperature began to return to normal, and I could hear the chapel doors opening behind me. Fresh mountain air swept through the building, carrying away the accumulated weight of impossible presence. When I turned around, the pews were empty again, the footprints gone, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, but something fundamental had changed. I could feel it in the way the organ responded to my touch, in the quality of sound that emerged from the pipes, in the subtle shift in the chapel's acoustics. The instrument was no longer merely functional. It was alive, imbued with the spiritual energy of its faithful congregation. I gathered my tools mechanically and walked to the main doors. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was touching the mountain peaks. Marcus stood in the courtyard, no longer gaunt and hollow-eyed, but somehow more substantial, more present. "The work is complete?" he asked. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "Then you understand your purpose here?" It wasn't a question. I did understand, with a clarity that terrified me. The organ needed more than maintenance. It needed a permanent guardian, someone to channel the devotions of the eternal congregation, someone to give their worship voice and substance in the physical world. "Brother Thomas has prepared your new quarters," Marcus continued, "more suitable for a long-term resident." I should have protested, should have demanded passage back to the world beyond the mountains. Instead, I found myself nodding acceptance. The thought of leaving the organ, my organ now, felt like abandoning a sacred trust. The faithful were counting on me. They had waited so long for someone who understood. That was 6 months ago. I write this account in my study adjoining the chapel, where I can hear the organ calling to me even now. My old life, my business, my apartment in Denver, my few remaining friends, seems like a half-remembered dream from someone else's existence. This is my reality now. Morning prayers at dawn, evening worship as the sun sets behind the peaks, and the constant presence of the faithful who gather each night to sing their impossible songs. Sometimes I wonder if I'm losing my mind, if the isolation and altitude have finally snapped whatever tenuous connection I maintained with consensus reality. But the music is too beautiful for madness, too perfect for delusion. When I play for the congregation, I am part of something larger than myself, something that transcends the petty concerns of the living world. Marcus and Thomas understand this. They were guardians before me, maintaining the sacred space until the right person could be found to complete the eternal service. Now they rest peacefully. Their vigil ended, their purpose fulfilled. I found their bodies in the rectory cellar 3 months ago, mummified by the dry mountain air, peaceful expressions on their weathered faces. I buried them in the small cemetery behind the chapel, where weathered headstones mark the graves of the original faithful. They deserve their rest. Their watch is ended. Mine has just begun. The sun is setting now, and I can hear the congregation gathering in the chapel. They're singing, "Come Thou Fount," tonight. I can tell by the anticipatory harmonies that drift through my window. It's time to take my place at the console, to give voice to their eternal praise. But first, I should mention the letters I've been sending. Carefully crafted inquiries to organ repair specialists across the country, describing a magnificent instrument in desperate need of restoration. The responses have been encouraging. Several experts have expressed genuine interest in making the journey to St. Bartholomew's Colony. After all, the faithful grow lonely with just my voice to lead their worship. A proper congregation requires multiple voices, each contributing their own gifts to the sacred music. Brother Theodore understood this. Marcus and Thomas understood this. And soon, others will understand as well. The organ is calling now, its voice clear and sweet in the mountain air. Time to join the service. Time to add my living breath to their eternal song. The faithful are waiting. Story 12. The scanner's blue LED cast dancing shadows across the moldering walls of Ward C as I fed another patient file through its mechanical throat. 3 days into this project, and the Millfield Sanitarium still felt like it was watching me. Every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind through broken windows seemed to pause when I looked up from my work. Dr. Matthews had been clear about the urgency. The county was demolishing the remaining structure next month, and the Historical Society needed these records digitized before the bulldozers arrived. 40 years of patient files, treatment notes, and administrative documents from what had once been the region's premier mental health facility. The pay was excellent, the timeline tight, and the location, well, atmospheric didn't begin to cover it. I'd set up my portable workstation in what used to be the nurses' station, a central hub with windows overlooking 3 corridors that branched out like skeletal fingers. The overhead lights had failed decades ago, leaving me dependent on the industrial LED panels I'd brought and the pale autumn sunlight filtering through grimy windows. The scanner hummed its mechanical rhythm as page after page of medical histories passed through its sensors, each document a fragment of lives once contained within these walls. It was during the second hour of my 3rd day that I first noticed the anomaly. The scanner had processed a thick file belonging to one Harold Brennan, admitted in 1952 for what the notes described as acute melancholia with paranoid episodes. Standard stuff for the era, plenty of references to electroshock therapy and experimental drug treatments. But when I reviewed the digital images on my laptop screen, there was something else captured in the scans. A faint silhouette, barely visible against the aged paper, like a shadow that had somehow been photographed alongside the text. I checked the physical documents. Nothing. Just yellowed paper and faded ink. The silhouette appeared to show a human figure in profile, arms positioned as if holding something, perhaps the very file I'd just scanned. I ran the pages through again, thinking maybe a smudge on the scanner bed had caused the artifact. The second scan came out identical, complete with the mysterious shadow. Professional curiosity overrode my growing unease. I'd worked with document preservation for 6 years, and scanner artifacts weren't uncommon. Dust, scratches on the glass, even electromagnetic interference could create unusual patterns in digital images. But this was different. The silhouette wasn't random static or geometric distortion. It had an organic quality, unmistakably human in its proportions and posture. I continued working through Harold Brennan's file, and the silhouette appeared in every scan, sometimes varying slightly in position or clarity, but always present, always human, always holding what looked like documents. By lunch, I'd discovered similar shadows in roughly 30% of the files I'd processed. They weren't consistent. Some appeared as single figures, others as multiple overlapping forms. A few showed what looked like medical equipment or furniture that didn't match the sparse contents of the actual documents. Each silhouette seemed to exist in its own reality, captured by the scanner but invisible to the naked eye. The logical part of my mind, the part trained in archival science and digital preservation, cataloged possible explanations. Residual electromagnetic fields from old medical equipment, chemical interactions between the scanner's sensors and compounds in the aging paper, some kind of pareidolia effect causing me to see human shapes in random digital noise. But logic felt increasingly inadequate as the afternoon wore on. I was scanning a patient intake form when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow had shifted across the wall of the eastern corridor, just beyond the range of my LED panels. I looked up, expecting to see a tree branch swaying outside one of the broken windows, but the shadow remained stationary, human-shaped, arms positioned as if holding something against its chest. The exact same pose I'd been seeing in the scanned documents. My hands had gone still on the scanner, the mechanical humming the only sound in the silence. The shadow on the wall mirrored my position perfectly, the slight forward lean, the angle of my shoulders, even the way my left hand rested on the edge of the document tray. But it was wrong somehow, like watching yourself in a funhouse mirror that reflected not just your image but your actions 10 seconds before you performed them. I lifted my right hand to touch my face, and the shadow's arm moved first, completing the gesture while mine was still rising. When I finally made contact with my cheek, the shadow had already returned to its resting position. The scanner's blue LED seemed dimmer now, its light barely reaching the corridor where the shadow waited. I told myself it was just the angle of the afternoon sun, the way illumination played tricks in buildings like this. But when I moved my left hand to flip to the next page, the shadow anticipated the motion, its arm sweeping in a graceful arc several seconds before mine followed the same path. I stood up abruptly, and the shadow's posture shifted to match. But again, it moved first, rising from its seated position while I was still pushing my chair back. It waited there on the wall, standing as I was standing, perfectly still except for the subtle sway that suggested breathing, watching me without eyes, mimicking me without understanding. The rational explanations felt increasingly hollow. Shadows didn't predict movement. They didn't maintain independent postures when their casters shifted position. They certainly didn't appear on walls perpendicular to any possible light source. I forced myself to sit back down and resume scanning. Work was the anchor, the familiar rhythm that could ground me against whatever psychological pressure this place was exerting. Document after document passed through the scanner, each one adding to my growing digital archive, while the shadow on the wall continued its unsettling dance of anticipation. The files themselves began to tell a story that matched my growing unease. Patient after patient admitted with reports of visual hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and persistent sensation of being observed. Treatment notes mentioned patients who claimed to see shadows moving independently of their casters, figures in their peripheral vision that vanished when looked at directly. Dr. Morrison, the sanitarium's chief psychiatrist during the 1950s, had written extensively about what he termed environmental psychosis, the tendency for institutional settings to amplify existing mental health conditions through isolation and atmospheric pressure. One file caught my attention particularly. Marcus Webb, admitted in 1954, had been found in his room claiming that his shadow was moving wrong. The intake notes recorded his insistence that reflections and shadows were acting independently, showing him what he was about to do before he did it. Dr. Morrison's treatment notes were extensive, documenting increasing agitation and a fixation on mirrors and reflective surfaces. The final entry mentioned that Webb had to be transferred to a room with no windows after he became violent toward his own reflection. As I read, the shadow on the wall began to move without any corresponding movement from me. It turned its head slowly, as if surveying the corridor, then returned to watching my position. The motion was fluid, natural, like someone stretching their neck after sitting in one position too long. But I hadn't moved at all. The LED panels flickered once, briefly, and in that moment of dimness I saw other shapes in the corridors, dozens of them, standing along the walls like spectators at some silent performance. When the light stabilized, the shadows remained, all of them oriented toward my position at the nurse's station, all of them perfectly still, except for that subtle sway of breathing. I checked my watch, nearly 4 o'clock. The autumn sun was beginning its descent, and the pale light filtering through the windows had taken on a golden quality that should have been warming. Instead, it felt thin, inadequate against the growing darkness that seemed to emanate from the building itself. The scanner continued its work, processing page after page of medical histories, but now every document contained shadows. Not just one or two faint silhouettes, but multiple figures overlapping and interweaving across the digital images. Some appeared to be patients in hospital gowns, others in the white coats of medical staff. A few wore what looked like the formal attire of visitors or administrators. All of them were engaged in activities that the physical documents couldn't explain, examining files, pointing at charts, gesturing toward areas outside the scanner's frame of reference. And all of them were looking at me. The sensation of being watched had become overwhelming, a physical pressure against my skull that made concentration nearly impossible. Every few minutes I'd look up to find the shadows on the walls had shifted position, moving closer to the nurse's station or turning to face me more directly. They no longer seemed content to mirror my movements. They were developing their own agenda. I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Stress, certainly. The isolation of working alone in a derelict building. The psychological impact of reading through decades of mental health records. The power of suggestion combining with environmental factors to create a perfect storm of perceptual distortion. But explanations felt inadequate when I watched my shadow on the eastern wall begin to scan documents that weren't there. Its arms moving through the motions of feeding paper through a machine that existed only in its reality. It worked steadily, methodically, occasionally pausing to examine something in its hands before continuing with its task. I found myself matching its rhythm, scanning the real documents in time with its phantom movements, as if we were partners in some elaborate dance. The files I was processing began to blur together. Names and dates became meaningless as I focused increasingly on the shadows appearing in each scan. The digital silhouettes were becoming clearer, more detailed, as if the scanner was somehow learning to see them better. I could make out facial features now, expressions of concentration or concern. Some appeared to be pointing at specific sections of text, as if highlighting important passages for an unseen reader. In one scan, a shadow figure appeared to be writing, its hand moving across the page while the actual document contained only printed text. In another, multiple figures seemed to be having a discussion, their postures suggesting animated conversation about the medical notes they were examining. The most disturbing discovery came when I began to recognize individual shadow figures appearing across multiple documents. The same silhouette would show up in files from different years, different patients, maintaining consistent proportions and characteristics. A tall figure with what appeared to be a beard appeared in nearly every scan from 1953. A smaller figure, possibly female, was present in most documents from the early 1960s. They moved through the digital archive like actors playing roles across different scenes of the same performance. As evening approached, the shadows on the walls had grown bolder. They no longer waited for me to move before demonstrating their actions. Instead, they seemed to be showing me what I should do next. The primary shadow on the eastern wall would reach for a new file several seconds before I felt the impulse to do the same. It would turn pages that I hadn't yet decided to scan, point to sections of text that would prove important for my digital catalog. The boundary between anticipation and instruction was dissolving. I found myself following the shadow's lead, scanning documents in the order it suggested, pausing when it paused, continuing when it gestured for me to proceed. The work was flowing more efficiently than it had all week, as if I finally had a knowledgeable assistant guiding the process. But the assistant was my own shadow, and it knew things I didn't. The last file of the day belonged to Dr. Morrison himself. Not a patient file, but a personal journal he'd apparently kept during his tenure at Millfield. The entries, dated from 1955 to 1958, documented his growing concern about what he called shadow phenomena among the patient population. Multiple individuals across different wards were reporting similar experiences. Shadows that moved independently, reflections that showed actions before they were performed, the persistent sensation of being observed by figures that couldn't be directly seen. Morrison's initial skepticism had gradually given way to a more disturbing hypothesis. He theorized that certain individuals, particularly those with existing psychological vulnerabilities, might be sensitive to what he termed temporal bleeding, moments when the linear progression of time became fluid, allowing perception to slip between past, present, and future states. The final entries in his journal described his own experiences with the phenomenon. He'd begun to see shadows of former patients in the corridors, shadows of colleagues who had transferred to other facilities, shadows of himself performing actions he had yet to decide upon. The journal ended abruptly with a note stating his intention to request a transfer to another institution. As I scanned the last page of Morrison's journal, the shadows on the walls began to move in unison. They turned away from the nurses' station and walked slowly down their respective corridors, maintaining their human proportions but stretching and distorting as they moved beyond the reach of my LED panels. Within minutes, I was alone again, the silence of the abandoned sanitarium settling around me like a heavy blanket. But when I looked at the final scan on my laptop screen, I saw myself. Not a shadow figure, but a clear, detailed silhouette that perfectly matched my position at the workstation. I was now part of the digital archive, captured alongside the medical records as if I belonged there. The timestamp on the scan showed today's date, but the silhouette appeared to be reading a document that I hadn't yet picked up. A file labeled Digital Preservation Project, Millfield Sanitarium Historical Archive. A file that didn't exist in my physical collection. I packed my equipment with shaking hands, leaving the remaining documents for tomorrow. The shadows had returned to the walls as I worked, standing in their original positions as if they'd never moved. But now they were all facing outward, away from the nurses' station, looking down the corridors toward exits I couldn't see. As I reached the main entrance, I turned back for one final look at the building. Through the broken windows of Ward C, I could see my LED panels still glowing where I'd left them, casting their blue light across the empty nurses' station. But the shadows on the walls weren't empty. They were still there, waiting at their posts, ready to resume their work when I returned tomorrow. And in the eastern corridor, perfectly visible in the artificial light, my own shadow remained behind, sitting at the workstation, scanning documents that existed in a time I hadn't yet reached. It looked up as I watched, raised what appeared to be a hand in acknowledgement, then returned to its task. I drove home through the gathering darkness, uncertain whether I'd be able to return to complete the project, but somewhere in the back of my mind I already knew I would. The shadows had shown me too much, taught me too much about the fluid nature of time and perception within those walls. And tomorrow when I returned to Ward C, I suspected they'd be ready to show me more. Story 13. The St. Catherine Medical College had been shuttered for 3 years when I first pushed through its rusted gates. Urban exploration wasn't exactly my hobby, more like a compulsion I'd developed since the divorce, a need to fill the suffocating silence that had consumed my evenings. The building squatted against the October sky like a diseased tooth, its red brick facade streaked with water damage and crowned by broken windows that caught the dying light like dead eyes. I'd heard about the place from Marcus, a photographer who specialized in abandoned buildings. He'd mentioned it casually over beers, describing the pristine condition of the morgue in the basement. Untouched, he'd said, his camera strap wound tight around his fingers, like they just locked the doors and walked away. What he hadn't mentioned, what I discovered as I descended the concrete stairwell, my flashlight beam dancing across peeling institutional paint, was the sound the building made when it breathed. Because it did breathe. The walls expanded and contracted with a rhythm that matched my pulse, or maybe my pulse had synchronized to the building's rhythm. Each exhale brought the scent of formaldehyde and something else, something organic and sweet that made my stomach clench. The basement hallway stretched before me, lined with doors bearing faded placards, storage, equipment, pathology. At the far end, a double door marked with a simple word, morgue. The lock had been broken long before my arrival. The doors swung open on silent hinges, revealing a room that contradicted everything I'd expected. Instead of decay and abandonment, I found a space suspended in time. Stainless steel surfaces gleamed under my flashlight, unmarked by rust or corrosion. The floor tiles, white with thin black lines, reflected my beam back at me with mirror precision. Along the far wall, a bank of refrigeration units waited like sleeping sentinels, their chrome handles polished to a surgical shine. 24 drawers in total, arranged in 4 rows of 6. Each drawer bore a small window of thick glass, though my light revealed nothing beyond the dark interiors. The air here felt different, thicker, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my forearms stand upright. When I breathed, my exhalations formed visible clouds despite the warmth of the room. I approached the nearest drawer with the careful steps of a man walking on ice. The handle was cold enough to burn when I grasped it, and for a moment I hesitated. Urban exploration had taught me caution. You never knew what you might find in places like this. But curiosity, that fatal flaw that had already cost me a marriage and 2 jobs, proved stronger than prudence. The drawer slid out with mechanical smoothness, its runners well-oiled and silent. Empty, as expected. A bare metal surface, clean and sterile, large enough to accommodate an adult body. I ran my hand along the interior, feeling for any irregularities, any sign of what this space had once contained. The metal was warm to the touch, warmer than the handle had been, and textured with tiny perforations for drainage. When I gripped the drawer's edge to push it closed, my world tilted. Weight. Impossible, undeniable weight. Not the resistance of a stuck mechanism or warped metal. This was the weight of substance, of mass that shouldn't exist. My muscles strained against it as if I were trying to move a body, a real body, something solid and heavy and present. The sensation was so convincing that I released my grip and stepped back, expecting to see something that hadn't been there moments before. Still empty, still just a metal drawer in an abandoned morgue. I tried again, this time preparing for the resistance. The weight was there immediately, constant and unyielding. As I pushed the drawer closed, fighting against that phantom mass, I felt something else. A subtle shift in the air around me. The temperature had dropped. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. My breath, which had been visible before, now formed thicker clouds. The digital thermometer I'd brought for checking camera equipment read 66 degrees. 3 more drawers. 3 more experiences of impossible weight, of pushing against something that existed only in the resistance it offered. Each time the temperature dropped 2 degrees precisely. 64, 62, 60. The room grew cold enough that I could see my breath in thick plumes, could feel the chill seeping through my jacket to raise goosebumps along my spine. By the time I'd worked through 8 drawers, the thermometer read 54 degrees, and my hands had begun to shake, though whether from cold or something else entirely I couldn't say. The building's breathing had grown more pronounced, the walls seeming to pulse with each inhalation and exhalation. Sometimes, in the space between breaths, I caught the sound of something else. A rustling, like fabric against fabric, coming from the closed drawers behind me. I didn't turn around. Some instinct, some primitive warning system honed by millennia of evolution, kept my eyes fixed forward. Instead, I continued my systematic approach, moving from drawer to drawer with increasing urgency. The weight grew heavier with each attempt, as if whatever occupied these spaces was becoming more substantial, more real. My muscles ached with the effort of closing them, and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the plummeting temperature. 18 drawers, 38 degrees. The cold had become a living thing, wrapping around me like wet cloth and seeping into my bones. My flashlight beam had begun to flicker, though the batteries were new. In the stuttering light, the shadows seemed to move independently, sliding across the walls in patterns that defied the movement of my hand. 20 drawers, 34 degrees. The rustling behind me had evolved into something more distinct. The sound of breathing that didn't match the building's rhythm or my own. Slow, deep breaths that fogged the air above drawers I knew to be empty. When I glanced at the small windows in the refrigeration units, they had clouded over from the inside, as if warm breath were condensing against the cold glass. 22 drawers, 30 degrees. Ice crystals had begun forming on the steel surfaces, delicate fractals that spread across the walls like living things. The building's breathing had synchronized with the sound from the drawers, creating a chorus of inhalation and exhalation that seemed to emanate from the very foundations. My own breathing felt labored, as if the air itself had thickened. 23 drawers, 28 degrees. As I gripped the handle of the penultimate drawer, something changed. The weight I encountered wasn't just resistance now, it was movement. Whatever occupied the space seemed to shift and settle as I pushed, adjusting its position like a sleeping person disturbed by movement. The metal grew warm under my hands, warm enough to sting after the bitter cold of the room. The final drawer, 26 degrees. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle, and not entirely from the cold. The weight here was different, not just heavy, but active. As I pulled the drawer open, I felt resistance that seemed almost deliberate, as if something inside were grasping the sides, trying to prevent its exposure. When I finally managed to extend it fully, the empty interior somehow looked less empty than the others. The metal surface bore the faint impression of a human form, subtle depressions where a head, shoulders, and hips might rest. Pushing it closed required all my strength. The weight fought me every inch of the way, and halfway through the motion I felt something that made my blood freeze. A hand, pressing against my palm from the other side of the metal. 5 distinct points of pressure, fingers splayed against mine through the drawer's base. Warm fingers, alive fingers, belonging to something that couldn't possibly exist in an empty space. I slammed the drawer shut with a violence that sent echoes crashing through the morgue. The thermometer read 24 degrees. Ice coated every surface now, transforming the sterile room into a crystalline cavern. My breath came in ragged gasps that hung in the air like smoke signals. And when I turned to leave, I discovered I was no longer alone. A face stared back at me from the surface of the main door. Not etched or carved, but formed from the ice itself. The features were indistinct, yet unmistakably human. Hollow eyes, a mouth slightly open as if in surprise or protest, cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows in my flashlight beam. It was the face of someone caught between sleep and waking, between presence and absence. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The face remained motionless, watching me with eyes that reflected my light back like mirrors. When I moved, the reflection in those frozen pupils moved with me, creating the illusion that the face was tracking my movements. The mouth seemed to shift slightly, the lips parting and closing as if attempting to form words that never came. The building's breathing had stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, amplified and echoing off the ice-covered walls. The rustling from the drawers had ceased as well, leaving only the drip of melting ice and the whisper of my own terrified breathing. The face in the door remained perfectly still, yet somehow I felt its attention like a physical weight, pressing against my consciousness with the insistence of a question that demanded an answer. I ran, up the concrete stairs, through the corridors, past the broken windows and rusted equipment. out into the October evening where normal air tasted like salvation. My car started on the first try, a small miracle that felt like divine intervention. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror compulsively, expecting to see something following. But the building receded into darkness without incident. It wasn't until later, safe in my apartment with the heater running and a cup of coffee warming my hands, that I remembered the selfies I'd taken outside the building before entering, a habit born of social media culture, though I rarely posted anything anymore. I'd snapped 3 photos of myself in front of the main entrance, using the phone's camera to capture the abandoned college behind me. The photos showed me clearly enough. Tired face, slight smile, the building's facade visible in the background. But there was something else, something that made my coffee cup slip from nerveless fingers to shatter on the kitchen floor. In each photo, superimposed over my features like a double exposure, was another face. The same face from the morgue door, but reversed, as if seen through a mirror. The hollow eyes stared out from where mine should be, the mouth opened where mine was closed. It was subtle enough that a casual observer might dismiss it as a trick of lighting or shadow, but I knew better. I knew exactly what I was seeing. The face looked hungry. I deleted the photos immediately, but the damage was done. That night, I dreamed of 24 bodies lying in 24 drawers, all of them wearing my face, all of them trying to push their way out while I held the handles shut with increasing desperation. I woke to find frost on my bedroom windows despite the heating system running at full capacity, and when I showered, the mirror fogged over in the shape of a human silhouette. 3 weeks have passed since my visit to St. Catherine's. I've told myself it was a psychological break, stress manifesting as hallucination. The mind, after all, is capable of extraordinary self-deception. I've scheduled appointments with doctors, considered medication, researched sleep disorders, and anxiety-induced psychosis. These explanations comfort me during the day, when sunlight streams through my windows and the world behaves according to rational laws. But every night, as the temperature in my apartment drops degree by degree regardless of the thermostat setting, I feel 24 pairs of hands pressing against the walls from the inside, and I know with absolute certainty that whatever I encountered in that morgue followed me home. The face appears now in every reflective surface, car windows, bathroom mirrors, the black screen of my television. Always in negative, always watching, always slightly more distinct than the time before. Sometimes I catch myself opening empty drawers in my kitchen, feeling for weight that shouldn't be there. Sometimes I find it. The building may be abandoned, but I'm beginning to understand that some places are never truly empty. Some spaces between presence and absence, between the living and the remembered, between what is and what should not be. I opened those drawers, felt the weight of what they contained, and in doing so, I may have disturbed a balance that was never meant to be shifted. Tonight, the temperature has dropped to 68 degrees. Tomorrow, if the pattern holds, it will be 66. I've counted the days, done the mathematics, and I know exactly when my apartment will reach 0 degrees. I know what will happen then. The face in my bathroom mirror grows clearer each morning, and yesterday, for just a moment, I thought I saw it smile. Story 14. The air inside the abandoned textile mill carried the weight of decades, thick with dust motes that danced in shafts of amber light filtering through grimy windows. I stepped carefully over broken glass and twisted metal, my footsteps echoing against concrete walls that had witnessed the industrial heartbeat of the 1930s. The assignment was simple enough. Document the building's structural integrity for the city's demolition committee. What I found instead was something that defied every rational explanation I could summon. The ground floor sprawled before me like a cathedral of decay. Massive looms stood silent, their metal frames draped in cobwebs that trembled in the faint breeze seeping through cracks in the foundation. Shafts of sunlight cut through the gloom at severe angles, creating a chessboard of light and shadow across the concrete floor. The smell was overwhelming: rust, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something organic and stale, like breath held too long. My clipboard and measuring tape felt inadequate against the building's overwhelming presence. Every surface seemed to watch me. Every shadow harbored movement that vanished when I turned to look directly. The silence was complete, yet somehow expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the narrow staircase tucked behind a bank of industrial switchboxes, spiraling upward into darkness. The city plans hadn't mentioned a second level. My flashlight beam revealed wooden steps, warped and stained, but surprisingly solid. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound swallowed immediately by the oppressive quiet above. The second floor opened into a long, narrow space that stretched the entire length of the building. Here, suspended 15 feet above the ground floor, ran a metal walkway, a catwalk that must have allowed supervisors to oversee the factory floor below. The passarella, as my grandmother would have called it in her native Portuguese, though I couldn't understand why that word surfaced in my mind now. The walkway stretched into shadows that my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. Rails lined both sides, painted industrial green decades ago, now flaking and rusted. But it was the sound that stopped me cold. A gentle creaking, rhythmic and slow, metal settling against metal in a pattern that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. I stood at the threshold for several minutes listening. The sound came from ahead, somewhere in the darkness beyond my light's reach. I stepped onto the walkway. The first thing I noticed was how the metal flexed slightly under my weight, a subtle give that sent vibrations through the entire structure. The second thing was how the creaking shifted, responding to my presence like a conversation. As my foot touched the grating, the rhythmic sound ahead seemed to pause, then resume with a different cadence. 3 steps in, I realized what the rhythm reminded me of. A cradle rocking. The slow, deliberate back and forth of a bassinet being gently pushed. But that was impossible. There was nothing here that could create such emotion, nothing that could sustain such a consistent pattern. I continued forward, my flashlight beam dancing across the walkway ahead. The creaking maintained its steady rhythm, always just beyond the edge of my vision. With each step, I felt the entire structure respond, a subtle sway that seemed designed to accommodate movement. The sensation was oddly comforting, like being rocked gently to sleep. That's when I heard the heartbeat. It started as a barely perceptible thrumming, so faint I thought it might be my own pulse echoing strangely in the confined space. But as I moved forward, the sound grew more distinct, more separate from my own cardiovascular rhythm. It was slower than mine, deeper, with a hollowness that suggested vast empty spaces. I stopped walking. My own heartbeat hammered in my ears, rapid and sharp with anxiety. But the other sound continued, steady and slow, emanating from somewhere ahead in the darkness. Ba-thump, ba-thump, ba-thump. Each beat perfectly timed with the creaking of the walkway. When I tried to move backward, to retrace my steps, the heartbeat moved with me. It didn't fade as I expected. Instead, it seemed to follow, maintaining its position just ahead of my location. I took 5 steps back toward the stairs, and the sound receded exactly 5 steps, staying precisely beyond my reach. Forward motion produced the same result in reverse. As I advanced, the heartbeat advanced. As I retreated, it retreated. But always it remained ahead of me. Always it beckoned me to continue deeper into the suspended corridor that stretched into impenetrable darkness. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Old buildings created acoustic anomalies. Metal expanded and contracted. Industrial structures often produced phantom sounds due to settling, wind patterns, or thermal changes. I documented similar phenomena in other abandoned facilities. But this felt different. Intentional. I forced myself to continue forward, one hand trailing along the safety rail for guidance. The walkway swayed gently with each step, and I began to notice that the sway wasn't random. It followed a pattern, like a gentle rocking motion that seemed designed to soothe. The creaking kept perfect time with this movement, creating a lullaby of rust and metal. 30 feet from the staircase, my flashlight began to flicker. The beam weakened, casting shorter and shorter cones of light ahead. Soon I was walking through sections of complete darkness, relying on the rail to guide me forward. The heartbeat grew stronger in the blackness, no longer just a sound, but a presence I could feel in my chest. A secondary pulse that seemed to be teaching my own heart a different rhythm. I stopped to check my watch, squinting at the luminous dial. I'd been on the walkway for 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. The building had seemed long from the outside, but not this long. I should have reached the far wall by now, should have found another staircase leading down. Instead, the walkway stretched endlessly ahead. When I turned to look back, my dying flashlight revealed only darkness. The staircase I'd climbed, the opening to the second floor, all of it had disappeared. The walkway extended infinitely in both directions, suspended in a void that swallowed light and sound. Panic touched the edges of my consciousness. I pressed forward, hoping to find an end, a wall, something to orient myself. The heartbeat ahead grew louder, more insistent. It was pulling me forward now, each beat a gentle tug against my own circulation. My legs moved almost without conscious direction, matching the rhythm of the unseen heart. The cradle song of the walkway filled my ears, a metallic lullaby that made my eyelids heavy despite my terror. Each step brought a wave of strange comfort, as if I was being guided towards something wonderful, something that had been waiting for me specifically. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed suspended along with the corridor itself. My flashlight died completely, leaving me in absolute darkness, but I didn't need light anymore. The heartbeat ahead provided all the guidance I required, each pulse a breadcrumb leading me deeper into the impossible space. Eventually, I began to hear whispers. Not voices exactly, but something like wind through fabric. Soft exhalations that might have been words in a language I'd never learned but somehow understood. They spoke of rest, of surrender, of the comfort that waited at the end of the walkway. They promised answers to questions I hadn't known I was asking. My own heartbeat began to slow, sinking gradually with the phantom pulse ahead. The sensation was profoundly peaceful, like sinking into warm water. Each synchronized beat brought deeper calm, deeper certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. That's when I felt the hands, not touching me, but present. Invisible fingers that seemed to trace the air around my shoulders, my back, my arms. A gentle pressure that guided my steps and kept me moving forward. The hands felt familiar, though I couldn't place them. They moved with the practiced care of someone who had guided many others along this same suspended path. I wanted to speak, to call out, but my voice had become something distant and disconnected. Instead, I let the hands guide me deeper into the darkness, toward whatever waited at the end of the infinite corridor. The walkway began to slope slightly downward. I could feel the change in my legs, the subtle shift that suggested I was descending. But descending toward what? The building had no basement, no lower level that could accommodate this impossibly long suspended bridge. As I walked, I became aware of sounds from below. Not the industrial noises I'd expected from an abandoned factory floor, but something else entirely. Soft shuffling, like fabric against concrete. Quiet breathing that seemed to rise from multiple sources. The whispered voices I'd been hearing weren't coming from ahead of me. They were rising from beneath the walkway, a chorus of gentle sounds that spoke of patience and infinite waiting. My synchronized heartbeat grew stronger, more insistent. Each pulse now sent waves of warmth through my chest, down my arms, into my fingertips. The sensation was addictive, a rhythm I never wanted to break. I found myself walking in perfect time with the beat, my footsteps creating their own contribution to the metal lullaby. The hands around me grew more substantial, though still invisible. I could feel their warmth, their careful guidance. They steered me around obstacles I couldn't see, kept me centered on the walkway as it continued its gradual descent into whatever space existed below the building's foundation. Time meant nothing here. I might have been walking for minutes or hours or days. The darkness was complete, timeless, comforting in its totality. There was no world beyond this suspended corridor, no life before the moment I'd stepped onto the creaking metal. There was only the heartbeat ahead, the hands around me, and the promise of rest that grew stronger with each step. I began to understand that the building hadn't been abandoned. It had been waiting for someone who would hear the heartbeat, who would follow the suspended corridor to its inevitable conclusion. The textile mill of the 1930s had been a beginning, not an end. The workers hadn't left. They had simply moved to a different level of existence, one that operated by different rules of time and space. The walkway leveled out, and I sensed I was approaching something significant. The heartbeat ahead grew so strong I could feel it in my bones, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very structure around me. The hands at my shoulders tightened slightly, a gentle pressure that conveyed both welcome and warning. Ahead, barely visible in the absolute darkness, I saw a faint glow. Not electric light, but something organic and warm, like candle flame filtered through skin. It marked the end of the corridor, the destination that had been calling me forward through all those impossible steps. As I approached the light, I began to make out shapes in the darkness below, figures moving slowly across what should have been the factory floor, but stretched instead into spaces that couldn't exist within the building's physical boundaries. They moved with the same rhythm as the heartbeat, the same gentle rocking motion as the walkway itself. The figures looked up as I passed overhead. In the dim glow, I could see their faces, peaceful, serene, wearing expressions of profound contentment. They weren't workers, weren't anyone I recognized from the living world. They were something else entirely, something that had found its way to this suspended place and chosen to remain. I reached the end of the walkway and found myself standing before a simple wooden door, painted the same industrial green as the railings, but somehow warm to the touch. The heartbeat was strongest here, emanating from whatever lay beyond the door. The hands around me withdrew, their guidance complete. A voice spoke from behind the door, though I couldn't tell if it was male or female, young or old. It asked a simple question: whether I was ready to rest, to join the rhythm that had been calling me, to become part of the suspended community that existed between the building's floors. I raised my hand to knock, to signal my readiness to enter whatever waited beyond the green door. But at that moment my phone buzzed in my pocket, a harsh electronic intrusion that shattered the timeless peace of the corridor. The spell broke like glass. I found myself standing on the walkway 30 feet from the staircase, my dead flashlight in one hand, my other hand raised to knock on empty air. The heartbeat was gone. The hands were gone. The door, the figures below, the impossible length of the corridor. All of it had vanished, leaving me alone on a perfectly ordinary suspended walkway in an abandoned textile mill. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my office. I'd been in the building for 6 hours, though I remembered only minutes. The sun was setting outside, painting the factory floor below in shades of orange and red. I walked back to the staircase on unsteady legs, my mind struggling to process what had happened. Had I fallen asleep? Experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by the building's oppressive atmosphere? The rational explanations felt hollow, insufficient to explain the vivid reality of what I'd experienced. But as I descended the stairs, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable, the gentle creaking of metal settling into rhythm, the distant echo of a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I didn't turn back to look. I completed my inspection of the ground floor in record time, noting structural damage and recommending immediate demolition. I filed my report the next morning and marked the case closed. The building was demolished 3 weeks later. I watched from across the street as the wrecking ball reduced the textile mill to rubble. When the second floor collapsed, when the suspended walkway crashed to the ground in a symphony of twisted metal, I felt something inside my chest skip a beat. That night, lying in my own bed, I listened to my heartbeat in the darkness. It was perfectly normal, perfectly steady. But sometimes, in the space between beats, I thought I heard an echo, another rhythm, fainter but persistent, keeping time with something I'd left behind in the ruins of the mill. I never went back to the site. But sometimes, driving past the empty lot where the building once stood, I can swear I hear the sound of metal creaking in a rhythm like a cradle. And my heart, for just a moment, remembers a different beat. The doctors say my cardiovascular system is perfectly healthy. They can't explain why my resting heart rate has dropped by 15 beats per minute since that day, or why I sometimes wake up feeling like I've been walking for hours. They can't explain the dreams where I'm suspended in darkness, following a sound that leads me toward a green door I never quite reach. But I know, somewhere, in a space that exists between demolition and memory, the walkway still sways gently in the darkness. The heartbeat still calls. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the city sleeps, I can feel invisible hands guiding me forward through corridors that span impossible distances. I'm not the only one who felt the pull. The construction crew that cleared the site reported strange incidents, tools that moved on their own, sounds like footsteps on suspended walkways that no longer existed. 3 workers quit before the job was finished, claiming they could hear their own heartbeats echoing from empty air. The lot remains empty. No developer has shown interest in the property, despite its prime location. Those who visit the site report feeling watched, followed, gently guided toward something they can't quite identify. The city has posted no trespassing signs, but they disappear regularly, as if something wants visitors to find their way to where the mill once stood. I think about that building every day, about the choice I almost made, the door I almost opened, about the figures moving peacefully below the walkway, following their own suspended rhythm, about the community that exists in the spaces between reality and dream, between heartbeat and echo. Sometimes I wonder if I really left that place at all, or if I'm still walking that endless corridor, following a sound that promises rest at the end of an impossible journey. Sometimes I wonder if the phone call that broke the spell was real, or just another layer of the building's patient deception. The only certainty is the rhythm. In quiet moments, I can still hear it. The gentle rocking of metal on metal, the distant pulse that isn't quite my own. It's waiting for me to return, to finish the journey I started on that suspended walkway. And someday, when the weight of the ordinary world becomes too much to bear, I think I will.